Good evening and welcome back to the channel. Tonight we're settling in for a long one, a story that history books have a curious habit of skimming past, footnoting, or quietly renaming. Tonight we're talking about the women of Regency England who loved other women, and who somehow, against a society built entirely to prevent it, found ways to keep that love. If this is your first time here, take a moment to subscribe so future episodes find you while you drift off. And if there's a piece of hidden history you'd like told at bedtime, leave it in the comments. Several of tonight's details came directly from viewer requests, and I read every single one. Now dim the lights. Let the room go quiet. Get comfortable, and if you'd like, imagine yourself somewhere warm and candlelit, far from anyone who might ask too many questions. Because tonight, we're going to spend a very long time in the company of women who built entire lives out of careful words, quiet loopholes, and love that history insisted on calling friendship. Have you ever wondered what it actually took to love a woman, as a woman, in an age with no vocabulary for it at all? How did they find each other in crowded ballrooms and quiet drawing rooms? What did families really think when two unmarried women moved in together and simply never left? Could you truly share a bed for 40 years and have the entire neighborhood nod along, calling it companionship? What excuses did they reach for? What private codes did they speak in, right under everyone's nose? And how many marriages, do you think, were really just very well-dressed disguises? Let's set the scene properly. It's 1813. You open your eyes in a room lit by a single guttering candle. The chemise you're wearing is so thin it might as well not exist. Someone is lacing your corset from behind, your maid, perhaps, or perhaps someone far more important to you than that title suggests. Nobody in the house is asking which. Downstairs, your mother is already rehearsing the names of eligible young men for this season's assemblies. And you are lying very still, thinking only of a letter folded beneath your pillow, in handwriting you'd know with your eyes closed, signed simply, yours entirely. Welcome to Regency England. Let's begin properly. Chapter 1. The institution called particular friendship. If there was one phrase that did more quiet, heroic work in Regency society than any other, it was this: particular friendship. Say it aloud in the right drawing room and doors opened. Two women could declare devotion to one another that would embarrass a Byron poem, move into the same house, share a single bed for decades, and write letters so tender they could set paper on fire, and society would simply nod approvingly and murmur, "How lovely! Such devoted friends!" It was the perfect cover. Except, and this is the part that gets lost, it wasn't always a cover at all. Sometimes it was simply the truth, dressed respectably, the way a love letter might be folded inside the pages of a prayer book so no one thinks to look twice. The real genius of particular friendship was its elasticity. It bent to fit whatever the two women inside it needed it to mean. For a great many women, the phrase was entirely accurate, an intensely close, deeply felt, but genuinely platonic bond, in a culture where husbands were so often absent, indifferent, or simply uninteresting that women turned to each other for the emotional nourishment marriage failed to provide. But for other women, the very same phrase became a convenient, socially sanctioned label for something with real physical weight behind it, something far too dangerous to name directly, and so it never was. The language built around these friendships was, whether by accident or design, gloriously vague. Women wrote of tender attachments, of sacred unions of spirit, of being wedded in soul if not in law. These phrases survived scrutiny because they echoed something society already approved of: the classical ideal of devoted friendship stretching back to Cicero and Aristotle, and the religious language of spiritual communion that filled every hymnal and sermon of the day. No one could accuse a woman of impropriety for borrowing sentiments that sounded, on the surface, like something lifted from a philosophy lecture. Never mind that Cicero, presumably, was not writing about wanting to press his lips to a friend's collarbone by candlelight. And crucially, society didn't merely tolerate these attachments, it actively cultivated them. Young women were taught, almost from the cradle, that female friendship was morally superior to any premature interest in men. Mothers beamed with pride when their daughters formed passionate bonds with schoolmates or neighbors. Clergymen praised female companionship from the pulpit as evidence of a well-ordered, virtuous soul. The entire scaffolding of Regency social life rested on one quiet assumption, that women's emotional universe revolved around other women, not men. Men existed for marriage, inheritance, and the securing of family lines. Women existed for everything that actually made life bearable: conversation, comfort, understanding, intimacy. This arrangement created something close to a loophole the size of a cathedral door. Because these friendships were not merely permitted but genuinely admired, women could be as openly affectionate as they liked without inviting the faintest suspicion. They could hold hands walking through a public garden. They could embrace with theatrical intensity at a reunion after even the shortest separation. They could weep without shame when parted and write letters so saturated with longing that a modern romance novelist might blush reading them. And every bit of it was simply filed under friendship. Nothing to see here. Just two ladies of refined sensibility, devoted to one another in a manner entirely befitting their characters. The true cleverness of the system was that it didn't require anyone to actually be fooled. Families could privately understand the shape of what was happening between their daughter and her particular friend, while publicly maintaining the fiction that nothing more than sisterly devotion was afoot. It was, in essence, the Regency version of two people quietly calling themselves roommates. A thin, deliberately unexamined curtain that let everyone save face while women got on with living. Your daughter wasn't unmarried because she preferred the company of women. She was unmarried because she had formed such an extraordinary friendship with Miss Elliot that any marriage would only distract from so rare and elevated a connection. Much better, very respectable. No further questions, thank you. Of course, the system had rules, and they were unforgiving to anyone who broke them. You could love with everything you had, but you could never once call it love in the wrong register. You could share a home for the rest of your natural life, but you could never make it too obvious that you had chosen this woman over every eligible bachelor England had to offer. You could write letters that would scorch the page, but you had to dress every sentence in the language of friendship, virtue, and sensibility. The system protected you, but only for as long as you protected the system in return. Step even slightly outside its boundaries, and suddenly the very same people who had smiled indulgently for years would remember, with startling speed, exactly what it was they'd been looking at all along. Chapter 2. Eleanor and Sarah, the friendship the world came to see. No pair embodies this entire delicate architecture quite like Eleanor Butler and Sarah Ponsonby, better remembered by history as the Ladies of Llangollen. Their story begins in Ireland, in the years just before the Regency proper, among the tangled web of Anglo-Irish gentry families. Eleanor, born into a strict and well-connected household, was being steered firmly toward one of two futures: marriage to a man she had no interest in, or a convent. Sarah, younger and from a less prosperous branch of a similar social world, was being pressured toward a match with an older man she found genuinely repellent. Neither woman wanted the life being arranged on her behalf, and neither had to look far to find what she actually wanted, because they had already found it in each other. So they made a plan that sounds, even now, almost too dramatic to be real. In the dead of night, dressed as men to move safely and unnoticed, they fled together, intending to vanish into a new life where no family could reach them. The first attempt collapsed almost immediately. They made it only a handful of miles before being discovered, cold, exhausted, and hiding in a barn. Their families were horrified, not, notably, because two women had run off together, but because they had done so dressed as men and caused a scandal loud enough to reach half the county. They were dragged home in disgrace and placed under close watch, their letters monitored, their movements restricted. It didn't matter. If anything, the forced separation only hardened their resolve. Within weeks, they tried again, and this time it worked. They settled at a rented cottage called Plausible in the small Welsh village of Llangollen. The location was chosen with real care, remote enough to offer genuine privacy, but not so isolated that visitors couldn't reach them, because visitors, it turned out, would come constantly from across Europe for the next 50 years. William Wordsworth wrote poetry about them. Lord Byron mentioned them admiringly in his correspondence. The Duke of Wellington paid a personal visit and left thoroughly charmed. For half a century, this small Welsh cottage became something close to a pilgrimage site for the era's most celebrated minds. Writers, aristocrats, philosophers, all making the journey to sit in the company of two women who had, quite simply, refused to be separated. Eleanor and Sarah dressed in matching, distinctly masculine riding habits, dark, tailored, unmistakably their own invention rather than any fashion the era offered women. They cropped their hair short. They filled their small home with a library extensive and serious enough to impress university scholars who visited. Their days followed a quiet, deliberate rhythm, gardening side by side, reading aloud to one another in the evenings, taking long walks through the Welsh hills, and keeping meticulous diaries chronicling the smallest details of their shared life. What survives of those diaries is remarkable, not for anything explicit because there is none, but for the sheer density of feeling saturating even the most mundane entries. Phrases like "my beloved," "my other half," "my heart's own companion" appear again and again, wrapped around descriptions of planting roses or mending a torn hem, ordinary domestic tasks that, somehow in their hands, never read as ordinary at all. What turned Eleanor and Sarah into legends wasn't merely that they lived together. Plenty of women did that. It was that they did it so openly, so unapologetically, and with such visible contentment that no one could quite bring themselves to dismiss them as scandalous. They were too educated, too well-connected, too thoroughly celebrated by people of real consequence. And so, rather than being condemned, they became something closer to a symbol, the very ideal of romantic friendship taken to its fullest, most devoted expression. Two women who had chosen each other over everything else and built a life of genuine mutual devotion, intellectual partnership, and quiet, sustained happiness. Their families, who had once tried so hard to separate them, eventually came around entirely, even providing them with small allowances to help sustain their household. Society at large came to regard them not as a cautionary tale, but as a kind of paragon, proof of how elevated, how morally serious female friendship could become. When Sarah died in 1831, Eleanor did not survive her by much. She followed just 2 years later. They were buried together, their headstones close enough to touch, in the small churchyard of the village that had sheltered them for half a century. Visitors still make the journey to Plausible today, walking through rooms where two women built an entire legend simply by refusing, again and again, across 50 years, to be pulled apart. Chapter 3. A second story, Anne and the woman who chose her anyway. If Eleanor and Sarah represent the romantic ideal, celebrated, admired, protected by their own fame, the story of Anne Lister and Anne Walker, unfolding slightly later but drawing on the very same social machinery, shows us something rawer. What it actually took to build this kind of life when you weren't already a legend, when it had to be fought for, negotiated, sometimes stolen. Anne Lister was, by any measure, an unusual woman for her era. She managed her own estate in Yorkshire with a shrewdness most male landowners would have envied. She traveled extensively, often alone, in an age when that alone was considered faintly scandalous for a woman. And she kept, across decades, one of the most extraordinary diaries to survive from the period, over 4 million words, a portion of it written in a private cipher of her own invention, blending Greek letters and mathematical symbols into a code so effective it went unbroken for well over a century after her death. Within that coded portion, Anne recorded in unmistakable detail her relationships with women, courtships, heartbreaks, and eventually, her long and complicated union with a wealthy neighbor named Anne Walker. Their relationship began less as romance than as calculation on Anne's part. Anne Walker had money and land adjoining Anne's own estate, and a union between them, however unofficial in the eyes of the law, made obvious practical sense. But calculation gave way, in the diary's own account, to something that reads unmistakably like genuine devotion. The two women eventually took communion together at a church in York, a private ceremony, unrecognized by any civil authority, that they both understood and referred to privately as their marriage. They moved in together at Anne's family estate, Shibden Hall, combining their households and their fortunes in a way that would have been legally impossible had either of them been able to marry a woman openly. To the surrounding community, they were simply two women of means sharing a large house, practical, sensible, nothing worth remarking on. Within the house itself, by every account the coded diary offers, they lived as partners in every sense that mattered to them. The relationship was not without real strain. Anne Walker's family disapproved intensely, viewing Anne Lister as a manipulative influence over a woman they considered fragile and impressionable. There were periods of separation, of doubt, of Anne's diary recording genuine anguish over whether the relationship could survive family pressure and social scrutiny. But it did survive, for years, through disapproval, through gossip, through the ordinary friction of two strong-willed women building a shared life, until Anne's death while traveling abroad, after which Anne Walker inherited what the law would allow, and quietly, grievingly, carried on alone. What makes this story so valuable, set beside Eleanor and Sarah's, is precisely its lack of glamour. There was no crowd of famous visitors, no poems written about them by literary giants, no protective halo of celebrity. There was simply a diary, encoded so carefully that its author clearly understood exactly how dangerous its true contents would be if read plainly, and a life built, quietly and stubbornly, in the gaps the law and society left unpoliced. Chapter 4. Letters written like lives depended on them. Because, in a very real sense, they did. This was an age before telephones, before any reliable means of instant communication. Letters were everything, a lifeline stretched across distance, the only bridge between two people kept apart by geography, family obligation, or simple circumstance. And the letters Regency women wrote to each other were, by any modern standard, absolutely unrestrained. My own beloved, I press my lips to this page and imagine it is your hand I hold. Discover a line like that in a dusty trunk today, and you would assume, correctly, that you were reading the words of lovers. But at the time, such letters were filed neatly under correspondence between friends. Because what else, society reasoned, could two respectable women possibly be writing to one another about? The conventions of letter writing in this period actually worked in these women's favor, granting them a freedom of expression that would have been unthinkable in ordinary conversation. Letters could be passionate, intimate, even startlingly physical in their language, and still pass as entirely respectable, because the whole culture of sensibility that dominated the era demanded emotional excess. A letter lacking overwrought feeling was considered cold, unrefined, faintly insulting to the recipient. So women wrote without restraint, understanding, whether consciously or not, that the very intensity of their language would itself become a kind of camouflage. Consider the phrases that appeared, again and again, in letters exchanged between women who loved each other. I dream of you nightly and wake with your name still on my lips. Every hour without you stretches like a season. I have read your last letter until the folds are soft as cloth, and kept it always near my heart. These weren't metaphors in the way we might assume, or rather, they were metaphors that meant precisely what they appeared to mean. The women writing them knew it. The women receiving them knew it. And somewhere, quietly, the family members who occasionally glimpsed these letters over a shoulder likely knew it too. They simply chose, again and again, not to say so aloud. Letters also carried enormous practical weight. When two women were separated by marriage, by family duty, by the sheer distances involved in Regency travel, letters became the entire substance of the relationship for weeks or months at a time. Some women wrote daily, filling page after page with the small, ordinary details of their day mixed seamlessly with declarations of longing. Others wrote less frequently but with such concentrated intensity that a single letter could sustain a woman for an entire month. These were not casual updates. They were emotional sustenance, proof, held physically in the hand, that the bond had survived the distance. The physical ritual of letter writing itself became a kind of intimacy in its own right. Women described in their diaries the particular paper they chose, the specific ink, the hour of the evening set aside for writing. They kissed the page before sealing it. They pressed flowers between the folds. They tucked in a single strand of hair. The letter itself became a stand-in for the body of the person who couldn't be present. Something to be held, to be carried in a pocket, to be slept with beneath a pillow, and reread so many times the paper wore thin and translucent at the folds. Naturally, there was always risk. A letter could be intercepted by a suspicious parent, discovered by a curious sibling, lost in transit and read by a stranger. Some women developed private codes of phrases that seemed entirely innocent to any outside reader, but carried a second, entirely different meaning between the two women who understood the reference. Others simply wrote openly, gambling correctly, more often than not, that their family's deep-seated assumptions about the nature of female friendship would prevent them from recognizing romantic love, even when it was written plainly on the page in front of them. Where these letters survive today, tucked into family archives, donated to university libraries, discovered folded inside the covers of old books in attic trunks, they offer us the clearest, most unguarded window we have into the emotional lives of Regency women who loved women. Diaries could be careful, circumspect, written with an awareness that someone might one day read them. The public record, obviously, is silent almost entirely. But letters were written in the moment, to the one person who mattered most, and they don't lie. They are raw, unfiltered, undeniable. They are proof that these relationships weren't merely tolerated footnotes to history, but were lived fully, passionately, one letter at a time, across decades. Chapter 5. The practical, convenient, entirely innocent matter of sharing a bed. Here is something worth understanding about Regency England. Houses were cold. Fireplaces were inefficient and expensive to keep burning through the night. Beds themselves were a genuine luxury item, not something every household could provide one for each occupant. So quite naturally, women shared beds constantly. Sisters shared beds. Cousins shared beds. Friends visiting for a fortnight shared beds with their hostess as a matter of simple hospitality. It was economical. It was sensible. It was, unless it wasn't, absolutely nothing worth remarking on. A woman might write, quite openly in her private diary, "Spent the night wrapped in dearest Anne's arms, both of us dreaming aloud of the life we mean to build together." And her own brother, glancing at the page, would think nothing more scandalous than, "How nice, they kept each other warm." The cover of pure practicality was so deeply embedded in the culture that even when the romantic subtext was, by any honest reading, essentially explicit, most people simply didn't see it, or more accurately, chose not to. Bed sharing was such an unremarkable feature of daily life that failing to offer your bed to a visiting friend would have been considered genuinely inhospitable. Where else would a guest sleep? The cold, fireless servants' quarters. Unthinkable. So women slept together as an absolute matter of course, night after night, sometimes for years on end, and the intimacy that naturally develops from that kind of sustained physical closeness was simply absorbed into the background of ordinary life. What else, after all, could possibly be happening? The bedrooms of wealthier women held a particular kind of significance here, too. These were among the only truly private spaces in the entire household, off limits to men, except under very narrow, specific circumstances. This made them something close to sanctuaries, spaces where women could set aside the constant social performance required everywhere else in the house. When two women shared that space, they shared that sanctuary together, free, for a few hours each night, to speak plainly, to laugh without restraint, to weep if they needed to touch one another without a single thought toward who might be watching, because no one was. Diaries and letters from the period are dense with references to shared beds, and the language used to describe them often makes the true nature of the intimacy hard to mistake. "We lay entwined together until the first gray light of morning," one woman recorded. "I felt her heart beating steadily against mine as sleep finally took us both," wrote another. "She held me close and murmured such tender words that I cannot bring myself to set them down here," confessed a third. These are not the diary entries of women simply conserving body heat. These are, unmistakably, love stories written in the only vocabulary available to women who had no acceptable way to name what they truly were to one another. The practical excuse extended naturally into travel as well. Two women journeying together would, as a matter of course, share accommodations at any inn along the road. Requesting separate rooms would have seemed both wasteful and, ironically, more suspicious than simply sharing, as convention dictated. This meant women could travel together for months at a stretch, sharing a bed the entire journey, all of it entirely respectable on its face. The very system designed to save money and preserve propriety inadvertently created an almost limitless supply of opportunities for real intimacy. There was, admittedly, a harder edge to this arrangement too. Because bed sharing was simply expected, women who genuinely didn't wish to share a bed with a particular companion often had no polite, socially acceptable way to decline. And women who did want to share a bed for reasons that went well beyond practicality had to navigate a strange, unspoken negotiation. How do you signal, without ever saying so directly, that this isn't merely convention but a choice? Some managed it through the smallest of gestures, the particular way a hand reached for another in the dark, the specific words whispered once sleep was supposed to have already claimed the room. The bed in Regency England was many things at once: a piece of household furniture, a source of practical warmth, a social expectation nobody thought to question, and quietly, for those who needed it to be, a private world where women could be together in ways daylight would never have permitted. It was simultaneously the most intimate space in any given house, and the most openly acknowledged public secret. Everyone knew in the abstract that women shared beds constantly. Almost no one paused to consider what that might actually mean in specific, particular cases. And in the gap between that general knowledge and that specific willful blindness, countless women found precisely enough room to love one another. Chapter 6: The Cult of Sensibility and How It Became a Permission Slip. The Regency era was, in a very real sense, obsessed with feeling. Specifically, it was obsessed with the notion that refined, cultivated people experienced emotion more deeply, more beautifully, more poetically than the ordinary masses ever could. Women in particular were expected to embody this, prone to fainting at moving news, to tears at a beautiful piece of music, to passionate declarations of affection offered without embarrassment. This cultural fixation created, almost by accident, the ideal environment for same-sex love to flourish entirely in the open. When a woman declared that her dearest friend was the very light of her existence, the only soul who has ever truly understood her, nobody so much as raised an eyebrow. Quite the opposite, they nodded with genuine approval. What refinement! What extraordinary depth of feeling! It functioned, in practice, almost like a permission slip to express as much devotion as one liked toward another woman, provided it was wrapped in sufficiently poetic language. Sensibility wasn't simply an aesthetic preference of the age. It functioned as a genuine moral framework. People considered to possess true sensibility were viewed as more virtuous, more attuned to beauty and truth, more capable of authentic moral feeling than their more reserved counterparts. This meant that expressing intense emotion wasn't merely socially acceptable. It was treated as active proof of superior character. A woman who wept over a sunset, or nearly swooned at a particularly moving passage of poetry, was demonstrating her own refinement. And a woman capable of expressing overwhelming devotion to a female friend was, by the same logic, simply showing the world how deeply, how purely she was capable of feeling. This created a genuinely convenient paradox. The more dramatically a woman expressed love for another woman, the more respectable, not less, she appeared. Restraint and emotional coldness were treated as evidence of a deficient, underdeveloped sensibility, while passionate, effusive declarations were read as marks of a noble soul. Women, in a sense, competed to be the most effusive in their affections, to write the most beautiful tributes to their beloved friends, to demonstrate the deepest possible devotion. It was a game the whole of polite society was actively encouraged to play, and the women who were genuinely, actually in love, simply had a considerable advantage in playing it. Literature of the period reinforced this fixation at every turn. Popular novels routinely centered passionate female friendships as major plot points, with heroines who loved their female companions, with an intensity that frequently overshadowed any romantic interest offered by the male characters. These fictional friendships were held up as genuine ideals, proof of the pure, elevated feeling society claimed to prize above all else. When real women modeled their own relationships on these literary templates, they were praised for their refinement, their adherence to proper feminine sentiment. Almost no one seemed to notice, or perhaps almost no one wanted to notice, how closely these celebrated fictional bonds resembled romantic love in every particular except the name. The language of sensibility also handed women a genuine vocabulary for expressing desire without ever having to name it directly. Instead of writing, "I want to hold you," a woman could write, "My very soul longs for union with yours in perfect sympathy." Instead of "I am in love with you," she might write, "You are the animating principle of my entire existence." The metaphors were unmistakably physical, souls uniting, hearts entwining, two beings merging into one, yet the literal meaning could always be denied if it ever came to that. It was, functionally, desire expressed entirely through the socially sanctioned language of refined feeling. Sensibility also provided cover for behavior that might otherwise have raised real questions. If two women wanted to spend every waking hour in each other's company, well, that was simply their two refined souls recognizing a perfect sympathy between them. If they wept dramatically at even a brief separation, that was evidence of deep, admirable feeling. If they expressed genuine, visible distress at the prospect of being parted, that only demonstrated the purity and intensity of their attachment. Nearly every behavior that might, under other circumstances, have signaled romantic attachment could instead be reframed as evidence of superior sensibility, and society would applaud rather than investigate. The cult of sensibility extended, quite naturally, into physical affection as well. Women could embrace freely, hold hands in public, kiss one another in greeting or farewell, sit for hours with arms wrapped around each other. All of it entirely acceptable, provided it was framed as tender feeling rather than desire. And because virtually no one in polite society wanted to entertain the possibility that women's affections might carry a sexual dimension at all, an admission that would have required acknowledging women had sexual feelings in the first place. This physical affection was simply absorbed, without question, into the broader performance of refined femininity. Of course, the entire system functioned only as long as everyone silently agreed to read the signs in a particular, sanctioned way. A declaration of devoted love was friendship. An embrace was tenderness. A shared bed was practicality. The language of sensibility supplied the script, and as long as everyone stuck faithfully to it, women who loved women could go on living in relative safety. But the instant someone declined to play along, The instant someone said the quiet part aloud, the entire delicate structure could collapse in an afternoon. And so women learned, out of sheer necessity, to become genuinely fluent in the language of sensibility, to perform their love as friendship so thoroughly, so convincingly, that sometimes even they themselves lost track of exactly where the performance ended and the plain truth began. Chapter 7. Marriage, the thing they were supposed to want. Marriage in Regency England was never really about love. It was about property, about family alliances, about the reliable production of legitimate heirs. For women who loved women, this created an obvious tension. Society expected them, without exception, to marry a man eventually. But here is the twist that made the whole system quietly workable. An enormous number of women, regardless of who they were actually attracted to, simply didn't want to marry in the first place. The marriage market was, by any honest account, brutal, often loveless, frequently humiliating, and carrying with it the very real possibility of death in childbirth. So when a woman quietly declared she intended never to marry, and would instead live out her life with a devoted companion, a great many families simply accepted the arrangement without further protest. A respectable, contented spinster with a suitable female companion was, from a family's practical standpoint, infinitely preferable to a public scandal. The pressure to marry, when it existed, was immense and inescapable. A woman's entire social value was measured almost exclusively by her marriageability, her dowry, her family connections, her appearance, her accomplishments at the pianoforte or in watercolor. From the moment a girl reached adolescence, her whole existence was oriented, relentlessly, toward securing a suitable match. She was paraded at assembly balls, formally introduced to eligible young men, carefully trained to be charming and accomplished without ever appearing too intelligent or too opinionated for a prospective husband's comfort. Marriage wasn't presented as a choice. It was an inevitability, a duty, the only genuinely respectable path into adult life. And yet marriage itself was, for enormous numbers of women, quietly miserable. Most matches were arranged for financial or social advantage, with little to no consideration given to actual affection or compatibility between the two parties. A woman might meet her future husband on only a handful of occasions before her wedding day. She would then spend the remainder of her life legally subordinate to him in nearly every meaningful respect. Her property became his property. Her body was, by law, largely at his disposal. If he proved cruel, unfaithful, or simply cold and indifferent, she had almost no legal recourse whatsoever. Divorce was nearly impossible to obtain, and when it did occur, was socially catastrophic for the woman involved. And then, of course, there was childbirth, dangerous, agonizing, and frequently fatal. Countless women watched mothers, sisters, and close friends die in childbed, and understood with complete clarity that marriage meant voluntarily accepting that same risk for themselves. Given all of this, it is genuinely unsurprising that some women simply refused the entire proposition. They declared themselves perfectly content with spinsterhood, preferring the freedom and physical safety of remaining unmarried over the considerable dangers and indignities marriage represented. Their families, naturally, worried about their long-term future. An unmarried woman without independent financial means was genuinely vulnerable, possessing no legal protection, no household of her own, no clearly defined social role. But if that same unmarried woman had secured a companion, another unmarried woman with whom she could reasonably share both her life and her limited resources, the entire situation suddenly looked considerably more stable from a family's practical point of view. Romantic friendships, viewed through this lens, offered families an alternative to marriage that many of them could genuinely accept. Two women living together could pool their resources, maintain a perfectly respectable household, and provide each other with companionship, care, and support well into old age. They would produce no heirs, certainly, but neither would they produce scandal, crushing debt, or illegitimate children. They would live quietly, modestly, and safely, precisely what many families actually wanted for daughters who had firmly declined to marry. It wasn't necessarily the ideal outcome any family had originally imagined for their daughter, but in a world of genuinely limited options, acceptable was very often the very best women could reasonably hope to achieve. Some women even used the threat of an undesirable marriage as a form of leverage. If a father was actively pressuring his daughter toward a match with a man she found repugnant, she might reasonably argue that remaining unmarried alongside her dearest friend was clearly preferable to a genuinely disastrous marriage. Faced with a choice between an unhappy, reluctant wife trapped in a bad match and a contented spinster living respectably in a romantic friendship, some fathers, weighing their options, simply chose the latter. It was leverage, not much, admittedly, but enough in certain circumstances to carve out a small measure of genuine choice within a system otherwise designed to deny women any agency at all. There were also, worth noting, women who did go through with marriage, yet still maintained deeply meaningful romantic friendships running alongside it. A married woman keeping a devoted female companion in her household was not considered remotely unusual. Wealthy women very often retained ladies' companions who lived with them and accompanied them everywhere they traveled. If that particular companion happened to be a woman the wife genuinely, deeply loved, her husband was frequently simply relieved to have someone else attending to his wife's emotional needs while he pursued his own interests, business or otherwise, elsewhere. These arrangements could prove remarkably stable over time, with husband, wife, and companion forming a functional household that, on the surface, worked reasonably well for everyone involved, even if the genuine emotional center of that household was clearly the relationship between the two women, rather than the marriage itself. The sheer brutality of the marriage market, in this strange and ironic way, actually created space for women to love each other more openly. Because marriage was so transparently understood as a transaction rather than a romance, no one genuinely expected a woman to find emotional or physical fulfillment with her own husband. She was, according to the culture's own internal logic, supposed to find that fulfillment with other women, inappropriate, respectable, entirely non-sexual friendships, of course. But the line separating an appropriate friendship from an inappropriate one was, conveniently, blurry enough that women who loved women could step across it while still maintaining the outward appearance of complete propriety. They said no to the marriage market and yes to each other, and somehow, against considerable odds, made it work within a system deliberately constructed to leave them no meaningful choices at all. Chapter 8. The Fine Art of the Plausible Excuse. We are simply the closest of friends. We are companions to one another in our shared spinsterhood. We find it most economical to share expenses. We are both, I am afraid, rather delicate and require one another's constant care. Regency women became genuine masters of the plausible excuse, and society, for the most part, accepted these explanations entirely at face value. This wasn't naivety on society's part. It was a shared, unspoken agreement to plausible deniability. As long as no one ever said, explicitly and out loud, these two women are engaged in a romantic and sexual relationship, everyone could simply continue pretending not to know. And that shared, deliberate pretending was, in many genuine ways, the true foundation of Regency's social life. The key to a genuinely convincing excuse was that it needed to be simultaneously transparent and believable. It had to satisfactorily explain why two women were living under one roof, sharing a single bed, spending literally every waking moment together, and expressing passionate, near-constant devotion to one another, while still maintaining a veneer of respectability sufficient to let families and neighbors accept the arrangement without ever having to confront what was genuinely occurring beneath the surface. This required a genuinely delicate balance. Too transparent an excuse, and people might start asking why it needed to be insisted upon so frequently. Too convincing, too airtight, and you risked forcing everyone around you to finally confront the thing they'd much rather continue ignoring. Companionship was, without question, the single most versatile excuse available. Every unmarried woman of the middle and upper classes was more or less expected to maintain a companion of some kind, someone to live alongside her, accompany her on social outings, provide conversation and reliable society. Hearing a companion for pay was already entirely normal. Having a beloved friend fill that same role was, if anything, considered even more respectable, since it was grounded in genuine affection rather than mere financial necessity. The fact that this companionship happened to involve sharing a bed, traveling together constantly, and building an entire shared life together was simply chalked up to practical efficiency. What else, after all, would companions naturally do together? Delicate health served as another consistently popular excuse, and it worked equally well in either direction. One woman might claim her constitution was too fragile to manage living alone, requiring the constant, devoted attendance of her closest friend. Or both women together might claim to be too delicate for the physical rigors of marriage and childbearing altogether, transforming their quiet shared life into something closer to medical necessity. Doctors of the period were, more often than one might expect, entirely willing to diagnose women with various vague nervous conditions requiring rest, quiet, and the calming, steady presence of a trusted companion. Diagnoses that conveniently lent real medical legitimacy to living arrangements that might otherwise have provoked uncomfortable questions. Financial considerations offered yet another perfectly convenient explanation. Two women sharing a household could genuinely split expenses, making limited individual incomes stretch considerably further. This was, on its face, entirely logical. Housing, servants' wages, household provisions, all of it became considerably cheaper when divided between two people rather than borne alone. No one needed to inquire too closely into why these two particular women had chosen to share expenses with each other specifically, rather than moving in with extended family or maintaining entirely separate establishments. This financial excuse proved especially valuable for working-class and middle-class women, offering them a version of the same cohabitation opportunities that wealth alone provided to aristocratic women almost automatically. Religious devotion, too, could serve as an entirely effective excuse. Two women might frame their shared life explicitly as a spiritual partnership, a mutual dedication to pious living and charitable works among the poor. They were, according to this framing, simply too occupied with serving God and their community to trouble themselves with marriage or worldly concerns. This particular excuse proved unusually effective, because it transformed their rejection of marriage into something that read as genuinely virtuous rather than remotely suspicious. They weren't turning down men because they preferred one another's company. They were turning down men because they had answered a higher calling. That this higher calling happened to involve living together in devoted, lifelong companionship was simply, conveniently, a happy coincidence. The real beauty of these excuses, and it's worth dwelling on this for a moment, was that they didn't have to be lies in order to function as excuses. Two women could genuinely benefit from companionship, could genuinely have delicate health, could genuinely find shared expenses more sensible, could genuinely be devoutly religious, and could also, simultaneously, be deeply and completely in love with one another. The excuses never needed to be false. They simply needed to provide an acceptable narrative sturdy enough to let everyone involved avoid asking the harder, more uncomfortable question underneath. Society, for its part, genuinely wanted to believe these excuses, because acknowledging the truth would have required confronting difficult questions about female sexuality, same-sex desire, and women's fundamental autonomy that almost no one in Regency society was remotely prepared to face directly. Of course, relying on these excuses meant women had to actively participate in the system's underlying hypocrisy. They had to pretend, consistently, that their deeply passionate, unmistakably romantic relationships were something else entirely. They had to accept being described, by the people who loved them, as companions or friends, even while privately understanding themselves to be very much more than that to one another. They had to watch their own families nod approvingly at their friendship, fully aware that this approval was contingent entirely on the relationship never once being named honestly. It was, in the end, a genuine bargain, safety, and social acceptance, purchased at the price of living inside a kind of open secret, visible to anyone who cared to look closely, yet never officially acknowledged, real in every meaningful sense, yet formally unrecognized. And for the overwhelming majority of Regency women who loved women, it was, despite everything, a bargain very much worth making. Chapter 9. How Families Actually Responded. Surprisingly often, more often, certainly, than modern assumptions about the period might suggest, families genuinely supported these romantic friendships. Not necessarily because they fully understood their true nature, but because they recognized them as safe, respectable, and considerably preferable to the available alternatives. A daughter settled quietly in the countryside with a devoted female companion was unlikely to generate public scandal, accumulate crippling debt, or run off unexpectedly with some entirely unsuitable young man. Some families actively encouraged these attachments, viewing them as an effective, low-risk way to keep their daughters safely occupied and out of romantic trouble. It was, in a sense, the Regency equivalent of a parent thinking, well, at least she isn't seeing that disreputable young man from London. Little did that parent typically know, their daughter wasn't pursuing him precisely because she was already very much taken elsewhere. For fathers in particular, a daughter settled into a stable romantic friendship represented an unusually neat solution to several practical family problems at once. She wouldn't require an expensive dowry, since she wasn't going to marry. She wouldn't need a husband's financial support, since she was living with a companion who genuinely shared expenses. She was unlikely to produce illegitimate children or elope disastrously with some unsuitable match. And she wouldn't become a financial burden on the family in old age, since she had a devoted companion prepared to care for her. From a purely practical, ledger book standpoint, romantic friendships often amounted to genuinely excellent family planning. Mothers, meanwhile, frequently supported their daughters' romantic friendships for somewhat different, more personal reasons. A great many mothers had experienced firsthand the real disappointments and genuine dangers of marriage, the loss of legal autonomy, the constant risk attached to childbirth, the particular loneliness of being married to a man who regarded his wife primarily as property rather than as a genuine partner. Watching their own daughters form deep, loving bonds with other women may well have felt, to some of these mothers, like witnessing a kind of freedom they themselves had never been permitted to have. Some mothers actively facilitated these relationships, inviting their daughters' companions to live within the family home for extended periods, personally providing chaperonage for the two women's travels together, and defending, sometimes quite firmly, their daughters' right to remain unmarried against pressure from other relatives. Brothers and sisters, too, were very often among the most quietly supportive family members involved. Siblings who genuinely cared about a sister's actual happiness might well recognize that she was far more contented with her particular female companion than she would ever likely be within a conventional marriage. They might notice, without ever quite nomming it, the way their sister's expression changed the instant her companion entered a room, the particular tone she used when speaking about her, the way she never seemed entirely herself during any extended separation. Rather than push for a marriage that would visibly make their sister miserable, supportive siblings would often quietly advocate for allowing the romantic friendship to continue undisturbed. occasionally even offering direct financial support to help the two women establish and maintain their own independent household. Family approval, when it was granted, nearly always came attached to unspoken conditions. The relationship had to remain outwardly respectable in every visible respect. No public displays of affection judged excessive, no behavior likely to invite gossip or genuine scandal. The women involved had to maintain proper connections with their families, dutifully attending required social functions, and fulfilling their expected obligations as daughters and sisters. And they had to accept being described, publicly, in whatever terms the family found comfortable, even when those terms bore little real resemblance to the actual nature of their relationship. As long as these unwritten conditions were consistently met, a surprising number of families proved genuinely willing to simply look the other way, indefinitely. Some families went considerably further than mere tolerance, actively embracing and celebrating these relationships in every way available to them short of formal recognition. They welcomed both women fully as family, treated the companion, in every practical sense, as a daughter-in-law, provided for her in wills, included her without hesitation in family gatherings and celebrations, and referred to the couple privately, among themselves, in language that came remarkably close to acknowledging what everyone already understood. These families quietly provided inheritances to both women, mourned genuinely when a relationship ended through death or forced separation, and recognized, even if they could never bring themselves to say so explicitly, that their daughter had found real love and genuine happiness, and that this mattered considerably more, in the final accounting, than strict adherence to conventional expectation. The presence of genuine family support could make an enormous, tangible difference in these women's ability to sustain their relationships over time. With that support came financial security, a measure of real social legitimacy, and meaningful protection from the harsher forms of gossip and scandal that could otherwise destroy an unprotected woman's reputation entirely. Women whose families genuinely supported them could live together openly, travel without provoking suspicion, and build stable, genuinely long-lasting households together. They didn't have to spend every day hiding, constantly anxious about discovery. They could simply live and love, and be loved in return, carrying the quiet knowledge that at least some of the people who mattered most to them truly understood and accepted the shape of their bond. But even the most consistently supportive families rarely, if ever, actually used the language of romantic love to describe these relationships aloud. They might describe a daughter as having found a true companion, or a kindred spirit, or simply her dearest friend in all the world. They might readily acknowledge that the bond in question was exceptionally close, even unusually intimate by any ordinary standard, but they stopped, consistently, just short of naming it plainly as what it actually was. That final, decisive step, formally naming the relationship as romantic, let alone physical, remained genuinely taboo, even among the very families most inclined to accept it in every practical sense. The approval, when it came, arrived bundled with an unspoken agreement that ran something like, "We will support you. We will protect you. We will welcome the woman you love fully into our family. But we will not, under any circumstances, call it love. Not that particular kind of love." And for women who desperately needed their families' continued support to survive comfortably in the world, that imperfect bargain was, more often than not, genuinely enough. Chapter 10. Class Money and Who Actually Got to Love Freely. Let's be entirely honest about something the Ladies of Llangollen's fame tends to obscure. Getting away with a same-sex relationship in Regency England was significantly, measurably easier if you happened to have money. Wealthy women could effectively purchase privacy, independence, and social insulation. They could rent isolated cottages in the countryside, travel together entirely unchaperoned across Europe for months at a time, and live comfortably without ever requiring a husband's financial support. Working-class women, by stark contrast, faced a genuinely much harder path. They lived under near-constant surveillance from employers, family, and neighbors, needed to work steadily for their own survival, and simply couldn't afford the considerable luxury of a private life. Class, in other words, didn't merely determine whether you could ultimately be with the woman you loved. It fundamentally shaped whether anyone would ever permit you enough quiet, unobserved space to even attempt it. Money, quite simply, meant options. A genuinely wealthy woman who wished to live with her female companion could establish her own independent household entirely, hire her own servants, and construct a private domestic space where no outside party had any real power to interfere. She could choose precisely where to live, perhaps a city where her family name meant relatively little, or a remote countryside estate where neighbors were sparse and gossip traveled slowly, if at all. She could travel extensively, using the ever-reliable excuses of health or education, spending months or even years abroad alongside her companion, comfortably beyond the reach of family scrutiny. Money bought distance, and distance, reliably, bought freedom. Wealthy women also enjoyed considerably greater access to education, culture, and the kind of intellectual social circles that treated romantic friendships not merely as acceptable, but as genuinely admirable. The intellectual and artistic communities of the era actively celebrated intense female friendships as visible signs of refinement and superior sensibility. Women with sufficient means could participate fully in these circles, attending exclusive salons, exchanging correspondence with celebrated writers and thinkers of the day, and building genuine reputations as learned, cultured women whose deep personal friendships were themselves treated as evidence of superior character. Their elevated class position offered real protection against the cruder forms of speculation and gossip that might otherwise have targeted poorer women in remarkably similar circumstances. Working-class women, meanwhile, confronted an entirely different set of obstacles. A domestic servant, a shopkeeper's daughter, a farmer's daughter simply could not announce her intention to live with a female friend and expect to maintain her reputation and standing in the process. She needed to work steadily for her own survival, which meant her time and movements were closely controlled by employers or by her own family. She couldn't realistically afford to rent private rooms, employ servants of her own, or maintain the kind of genuinely independent household that offered wealthier women meaningful privacy. She was, instead, constantly surrounded by family, by employers, by neighbors, by fellow workers, people who noticed everything and had comparatively little social incentive to maintain the same polite fictions that protected their social betters. For working-class women, romantic friendships, when they existed, often had to be conducted in genuinely stolen moments, brief meetings snatched after a long day's work, secretly exchanged letters, whispered conversations carried out in shared rooms with little privacy. They couldn't realistically travel together or establish a shared household openly without immediately raising uncomfortable questions about propriety and morality. And should anyone come to suspect the actual truth of their relationship, the consequences facing working-class women were considerably harsher than anything a wealthy woman ever needed to seriously fear: immediate loss of employment, eviction from lodgings, public shamming, and often complete, unrecoverable social isolation. Middle-class women, meanwhile, occupied a genuinely complicated space suspended between these two extremes. They might possess just enough independent means to establish a modest shared household, but rarely enough to entirely escape their family's ongoing financial oversight. They might be able to justify keeping a companion, but generally only by carefully framing the arrangement as sensible and economical rather than merely frivolous. Their reputations, meanwhile, mattered enormously to their family's broader social standing, meaning middle-class women had to remain extremely careful about maintaining every visible appearance of propriety, even while actively pursuing genuine relationships with other women behind that careful facade. Class also fundamentally shaped what kind of romantic friendship was even realistically possible. Wealthy women could build relationships centered primarily around emotional and intellectual connection. They possessed the genuine leisure time necessary for long, unhurried conversations, shared reading, extended letter writing, and leisurely travel together. Working-class women's relationships, by stark necessity, tended to be considerably more practical in nature, built around shared labor, mutual survival, and the daily struggle simply to get by. This doesn't mean working-class relationships were somehow less genuinely loving, but they had to exist within far tighter, more constrained circumstances, and could rarely aspire to the idealized romantic friendship so celebrated in contemporary literature and upper-class society. The particular intersection of class and gender meant that poorer women who loved women faced a genuine double marginalization. They were already made vulnerable by their gender alone, unable to own property outright, unable to earn genuinely fair wages, unable to live independently without some form of male protection or sponsorship. Adding a same-sex relationship into that existing precarity made their overall position considerably more tenuous still. They simply could not afford to alienate their families, lose secure employment, or damage their reputation, because they had no financial cushion whatsoever to absorb the consequences. Their love, of genuine necessity, had to exist largely in the shadows, frequently unacknowledged, often entirely unsupported by anyone outside the relationship itself, which makes it all the more remarkable, honestly, that a considerable number of women nonetheless managed to sustain these relationships across real time, despite every obstacle stacked deliberately against them. Chapter 11. A Secret Language Hidden in Plain Sight. Regency women were, without exception, deeply fluent in the language of flowers, an elaborate, genuinely sophisticated system in which nearly every bloom carried its own precise, widely understood meaning. Violets signaled faithfulness. Roses declared open love. Forget-me-nots whispered, quite literally, "Remember me always." Women who loved other women used this floral vocabulary constantly to communicate feelings they could never say aloud, sending carefully composed bouquets that functioned, in every meaningful sense, as love letters rendered in petals rather than ink. And beyond flowers alone, these women developed elaborate private codes of their own, invented nicknames, running private jokes, shared references that only the two of them could possibly understand. It amounted to an entire secret language, hidden in perfectly plain sight, and to anyone who genuinely knew how to read it, virtually every drawing room in England was quietly full of women flirting with considerable audacity. Floriography, as this floral language was formally known, was never simply a charming, decorative custom. It functioned as a genuinely sophisticated communication system that allowed women to express otherwise forbidden feelings with real safety. Each individual flower carried multiple possible meanings depending entirely on its color, its context, and its particular combination with other blooms in the same arrangement. This considerable complexity meant a single bouquet could easily carry layered meaning, a surface-level message readable by literally anyone, and a deeper, considerably more intimate message intended solely for the recipient. A woman might send red roses, symbolizing passionate love, deliberately mixed with violets for faithfulness and forget-me-nots for enduring remembrance, and any casual observer would simply think, "How lovely! What a beautiful arrangement!" But the intended recipient would read it correctly as an unmistakable declaration. "I love you passionately. I remain faithful to you. I will never, under any circumstances, forget you." Women became genuine experts at encoding real emotion into these floral arrangements. A single white camellia meant roughly, "You are utterly adorable." Pink camellias signaled, more specifically, "I long for you constantly." Red camellias declared, with real intensity, "You are a flame burning steadily in my heart." Lavender carried a considerably more complicated dual meaning of devotion tangled with distrust, a fittingly complex flower for genuinely complicated feelings. Pansies signaled simply, "You occupy my every thought." Primroses whispered quietly, I find I cannot live without you. Women could construct entire emotional narratives using nothing but carefully chosen flowers, bouquets that functioned simultaneously as poetry, as heartfelt confession, and as solemn private promise. But flowers, genuinely, were only the beginning of this hidden vocabulary. Women developed elaborate, deeply personal private languages with their beloved companions, entire systems of meaning invisible to any outsider, yet crystal clear to the two women who shared them. They invented private nicknames that read as simultaneously innocent and deeply intimate. They referenced shared memories and private running jokes that transformed ordinary, unremarkable conversation into fully coded love letters, spoken aloud in company. A woman might casually remark, "I saw the most beautiful sunset this evening," and her companion, understanding the true reference, would read this correctly as, "I was thinking of you all evening and wishing desperately that you had been there beside me." Every shared experience gradually became a private reference point. Every inside joke functioned as a kind of secret handshake. Some women drew on literary references as an especially effective form of code. They quoted poetry or entire passages from novels that carried very specific private meanings within the particular context of their own relationship, using someone else's carefully chosen words to express what they themselves couldn't say directly. A single line drawn from a Shakespearean sonnet, or a passage lifted from a popular novel about passionate friendship, could communicate an entire private world of meaning between two people who understood the reference. The particular genius of literary references lay in the fact that they appeared, on the surface, entirely educated and respectable, precisely the sort of intellectual material refined women were expected to discuss, while simultaneously carrying deeply personal, unmistakably romantic subtext for anyone who knew to look for it. Letters between women were consistently full of these layered codes. A woman might write, seemingly innocuously, about the weather. "It has been terribly cold these past weeks without the warmth of your company," and mean something considerably more intimate than any straightforward meteorological observation. She might describe missing our long walks in the garden, when what she genuinely missed was the particular privacy those walks had always afforded them, the rare, stolen opportunity to hold hands entirely out of sight of the house. Nearly everything carried this kind of double meaning, and much of the genuine pleasure lay precisely in learning to read carefully between the lines, in searching out the deeper message hidden beneath the surface message. Physical objects, too, consistently carried encoded meaning of their own. A woman might present her beloved companion with a ring, describing it publicly as a simple token of friendship, while both women privately understood it as something considerably closer to an engagement ring in every meaningful sense. A locket containing a miniature portrait could be worn openly as a memorial to a cherished friend, while privately functioning as a constant, treasured reminder of the beloved's face. Books were frequently exchanged, bearing carefully worded, deeply meaningful inscriptions. Handkerchiefs were traded and treasured for years. Pieces of jewelry were worn quietly as secret, private symbols of devotion that only the two women involved ever fully understood. The real genius of these elaborate codes lay in the fact that they offered genuine plausible deniability, while still permitting authentic communication between two people who understood each other completely. If a letter full of careful flower references and poetic literary quotations happened to be intercepted by a suspicious relative, they would see nothing beyond the typical, unremarkable effusiveness expected of refined female friendship. They would never realize that "I dream constantly of the day we are finally reunited" was not merely a casual pleasantry, but a genuine expression of deep longing. They would never suspect that a single pressed violet, tucked carefully inside the folded letter, constituted an actual declaration of unwavering faithfulness. The code protected the two women involved from real discovery, while still allowing them full communication of their genuine, deeply felt feelings toward one another. These secret languages also, quite naturally, deepened genuine intimacy through the simple act of shared, exclusive knowledge. Every single time two women employed their own private codes, they reinforced, however subtly, the boundary separating their genuinely private world from the public world observing them from outside. They were saying, in effect, this belongs entirely to us. No one else fully understands this. No one else needs to. It was, in the end, a genuine and sustained way of creating and maintaining a relationship that existed in careful parallel to the public friendship everyone around them believed they were witnessing. And in a world where women who loved other women had remarkably few available ways to claim their relationships openly and publicly, these carefully maintained secret languages became precisely how they claimed them privately instead. One flower, one coded phrase, one meaningful glance exchanged across a crowded drawing room at a time. Chapter 12. When the careful performance collapsed. Not every woman managed to get away with it. Some were simply too open in their affections, too openly defiant of convention, or, on occasion, simply unlucky enough to be discovered by the wrong person at the wrong moment. When the carefully maintained subterfuge finally failed, when someone, deliberately or accidentally, named plainly what was actually happening, the consequences that followed could be genuinely brutal. Families could force immediate, total separations. Financial support could be cut off entirely and without warning. Women could be locked away under the convenient medical guise of treating hysteria or vague nervous disorders. The underlying threat of exactly this kind of exposure hovered, always, over even the most stable and long-lasting romantic friendships, like a chaperone who simply refuses, under any circumstances, to leave the room. Survival, in this context, depended not merely on genuine love, but on considerable discretion, careful strategy, and a real willingness to play the entire elaborate game skillfully enough to remain permanently under the radar. The precise line separating acceptable behavior from unacceptable behavior was maddeningly thin, and it shifted constantly depending on circumstance. A woman could write passionate letters, share a bed for years on end, and declare undying devotion to her companion. All of it, on its own, was considered perfectly fine within the accepted framework. But should she refuse to perform an appropriate, expected level of interest in eligible men, should she become too visibly dismissive of genuine marriage proposals, should her clear preference for the company of women become too obvious for polite society to comfortably overlook, suddenly, without warning, she became genuinely suspicious in the eyes of the people around her. The real trick, the one every woman in this position understood intuitively, was to remain devoted, but never too devoted, passionate, but never too passionate, intimate as sisters, but never in any way that might force an observer to confront what genuine intimacy actually looked like. Some women simply miscalculated. They placed trust in the wrong person, sharing the plain truth of their relationship with someone who ultimately couldn't be trusted with it. They assumed, mistakenly, that a family's long-standing tolerance necessarily meant genuine acceptance. They grew comfortable enough over time to stop performing even the minimal expected interest in men entirely. And then someone, a jealous relative, a spurned suitor, a dismissed servant nursing a private grudge, would say something. It rarely even needed to be entirely accurate. It merely needed to plant sufficient doubt, to prompt people to start looking more carefully at what had in truth been hiding in perfectly plain sight the entire time. Once that initial question was raised, the surrounding social machinery could turn genuinely vicious with remarkable speed. Doctors would be consulted, more often than not eager to diagnose erotic insanity, hysterical attachment, or some other conveniently medicalized term for what was, in plainer language, simply loving women. The prescribed treatment invariably was separation, immediate, total, and without appeal. The two women would be formally forbidden from seeing each other, from writing to one another, sometimes even from speaking each other's names aloud within the family home. If they resisted this separation, More severe measures frequently followed: confinement within private asylums, forced marriage intended as a kind of cure, or exile to distant relatives, specifically tasked with maintaining close, permanent surveillance. The genuine cruelty of these forced separations is difficult to overstate. Women who had built entire lives together, who had shared decades of real devotion, could be violently torn apart with no meaningful opportunity for a final goodbye, no chance to make any lasting plans, no acknowledgement whatsoever that what they were losing amounted to anything more significant than an unusually close, if somewhat unhealthy, friendship. Their letters were routinely intercepted and destroyed outright. Personal belongings connected to the other woman were frequently confiscated. Every visible trace of the relationship was, wherever possible, systematically erased, as though love itself could simply be deleted through sufficient application of family will and sustained social pressure. Some women, tragically, genuinely died as a direct result of these enforced separations, not metaphorically, but in fact. The historical record contains numerous documented cases of women who fell into deep, sustained depressions following separation, who stopped eating entirely, who developed mysterious, unexplained illnesses, and who simply faded away in the months and years following their forced separation from a beloved companion. Their eventual deaths would typically be attributed, in official family accounts, to natural causes or to a naturally delicate constitution. Never, ever, to genuine heartbreak, and certainly never to the real violence inherent in having a woman's primary emotional attachment severed by people who fundamentally refused to understand what that attachment had actually meant to her. Others survived these forced separations, but remained permanently altered by the experience. They learned, out of hard necessity, to be considerably more careful going forward, more genuinely secretive, more willing to convincingly perform interest in men in order to avoid arousing renewed suspicion. Some eventually found new companions, though they rarely loved quite as openly a second time. Others gave up entirely on the prospect of future love, resigning themselves instead to permanent isolation rather than risk experiencing that particular kind of devastating loss a second time. The lesson, in every such case, was unmistakably clear. You could love, genuinely and fully, but only for as long as you remained willing and able to hide it convincingly. The moment you became visible, the moment you stopped performing the necessary fiction carefully enough, you became, immediately and completely, vulnerable. There were also, worth mentioning, women destroyed not through forced separation, but through outright public exposure. Their private letters would be discovered, and in the cruelest cases, read aloud before horrified assembled family members. Their romantic friendship would become the subject of open public scandal, whispered about in drawing rooms and gossiped over after Sunday services. Even in cases where the two women were never physically separated by force, their reputations could still be entirely shattered by such exposure. No respectable family would continue receiving them socially. Their own families might well cut them off, both financially and emotionally. In response to the scandal, they could become, essentially overnight, social pariahs, held up publicly as cautionary examples of precisely what happened when women dared to step too visibly outside the accepted boundaries of respectable feminine behavior. The genuine danger inherent in all of this was never merely hypothetical or comfortably distant. It was immediate, personal, and constantly present. Every single woman living within a romantic friendship almost certainly knew, personally or by close reputation, at least one other woman who had been caught, forcibly separated, or entirely socially destroyed by exactly this kind of exposure. They had heard the stories directly. They had witnessed the genuine consequences firsthand. They had internalized the lesson thoroughly, and so they learned, out of pure necessity, to remain careful, to maintain the protective fiction consistently, to never quite allow themselves to fully let their guard down, even in private moments. They loved fiercely and completely. but always, invariably, with one careful eye kept firmly on the door, always fully aware that the entire life they had painstakingly built together existed only at society's continued sufferance, and could, in principle, be taken from them entirely the moment someone decided they had finally gone too far. Chapter 13. The Bluestockings' Love Disguised as Learning. The Bluestockings were loosely organized circles of educated, intellectually serious women who gathered regularly to discuss literature, philosophy, and ideas, genuinely radical activity for women of this particular era. These informal salons became rare, protected spaces where women could form deep emotional and intellectual bonds well away from the prying, watchful eyes of men and conventional society more broadly. A great many of these women never married at all, choosing instead to form lifelong partnerships with other women drawn from within their intellectual circles. The intellectual justification granted them considerable respectability, but the genuine emotional intimacy underneath belonged, in every meaningful sense, entirely to them. The term bluestocking itself was originally intended as a genuine insult, a dismissive way of mocking women considered to care more about books than about ballroom fashion. But the women themselves reclaimed the label with real pride over time. They hosted regular gatherings where genuine intellectual conversation replaced idle card games, where a serious discussion of Milton's poetry was considered considerably more important than the usual endless discussion of marriage prospects. These particular salons drew some of the most genuinely brilliant women of the entire era, accomplished writers, skilled translators, serious poets, formidable independent thinkers who had absolutely no interest in pretending to be less intelligent than they actually were solely to attract a suitable husband. Within these carefully cultivated circles, women found something quietly revolutionary, other women who genuinely valued them first and foremost for their minds. They could debate serious philosophy openly, critique contemporary literature with real rigor, discuss politics, and be taken genuinely seriously as intellectual equals. More significantly still, they could form friendships grounded primarily in intellectual compatibility and shared passion for ideas, rather than mere social convenience. When two genuinely brilliant women recognized real kinship in each other across a crowded salon, when they discovered, perhaps, that they had both independently been reading the exact same obscure philosopher or quietly composing similar poetry in private, the resulting connection could feel genuinely electric. And very often, that initial intellectual connection deepened over time into something considerably more intimate. The particular beauty of these intellectual circles lay in the near-perfect cover they provided for genuinely romantic relationships. When two women spent hour after hour together deep in earnest discussion of Locke and Rousseau, no one considered it suspicious. They were considered admirably dedicated to serious learning. When they traveled together to visit fellow Bluestockings or to attend public lectures, they were understood to be furthering their education, not conducting a private relationship. When they moved in together specifically to collaborate on a shared translation project or joint research, they were simply being sensible and professionally practical. The intellectual justification, quite genuinely, made nearly everything else possible. These circles also created genuine, functioning networks of mutual support. Bluestocking women consistently looked out for one another, offering practical financial assistance when it was needed, and providing genuinely safe spaces for women whose relationships might not otherwise be readily accepted by their own families. If a woman needed to escape a forced marriage or an especially controlling family situation, fellow Bluestockings would frequently help her locate safe housing, introduce her to potential new companions, and help integrate her comfortably into circles where her unmarried status would never be seriously questioned. These women understood something the wider outside world consistently failed to grasp: that women could genuinely build meaningful, fulfilling lives entirely without husbands. The intellectual focus of these circles also meant these particular women often had genuine careers, ongoing projects, and identities extending well beyond their romantic relationships alone. They worked as translators, published writers, dedicated educators, and generous patrons of the arts. This afforded at least some of them real financial independence, along with the kind of social credibility that offered meaningful protection against the harshest assumptions typically directed at unmarried women. A bluestocking, by this framing, was never merely a spinster who had somehow failed to catch a husband. She was, instead, a genuine scholar who had deliberately chosen learning over marriage. The framing, quite simply, made all the difference in how she was regarded. Many bluestocking partnerships ultimately lasted for decades. Women collaborated together on serious intellectual projects, jointly ran literary salons for years at a stretch, and built entire shared lives centered firmly around learning and genuine creativity. They edited each other's written work, discussed ideas together late into the night, and created shared domestic spaces overflowing with books, manuscripts, and endless, unhurried conversation. These were never merely relationships of casual leisure or simple practical convenience. They were, in every meaningful sense, genuine partnerships of both mind and heart, grounded in real mutual respect, shared intellectual passion, and authentic engagement with ideas. The surviving correspondence between bluestocking women reveals, quite clearly, the true depth of these particular bonds. They wrote to each other extensively about ideas, certainly, but also, just as often, about longing, about devotion, about the genuine pain of separation. A woman might compose an entire letter carefully analyzing a philosophical text, only to close with a line like, "I find I cannot bear another single day without seeing your dear face again." The intellectual and the genuinely romantic were, in these relationships, essentially inseparable, two closely related aspects of precisely the same deep connection. Of course, not every bluestocking relationship carried romantic weight. A great many were genuinely, entirely platonic friendships built purely on intellectual compatibility and shared curiosity. But these circles created space for both kinds of relationship to exist comfortably side by side. And crucially, no one within these circles felt any particular need to carefully distinguish which was genuinely which. In a broader world thoroughly obsessed with categorizing and tightly controlling women's relationships with each other, the bluestockings created rare spaces where genuine ambiguity was not merely tolerated but actively permitted, where the true exact nature of any given bond between two women remained, quite simply, nobody's business but their own. You could be intellectual collaborators, close companions, devoted friends, genuine lovers, or, quite plausibly, all of these things at once. And as long as you could discuss Dante with real intelligence and insight, you were, in every practical sense, welcome among them. Chapter 14. Boarding School, where so many first learned what love felt like. Girls' boarding schools throughout the Regency era were, quite reliably, hotbeds of intense female friendship, and often, considerably more than mere friendship. Young women spent years living together in genuinely close quarters, sharing beds, forming deeply passionate attachments, and writing one another love letters intense enough to make a professional romance novelist blush with recognition. Teachers, remarkably often, actively encouraged these particular friendships, viewing them as morally superior in every respect to any premature heterosexual attraction toward men. A considerable number of these school friendships continued long after formal education ended, with former classmates eventually moving in together as adults, traveling together for years, and remaining devoted companions for the remainder of their lives. Boarding school, in this real sense, wasn't merely a place of formal education. For many women, it was where they first genuinely learned what it actually felt like to fall in love. Officially, boarding schools existed to prepare young ladies properly for eventual marriage and motherhood, teaching the standard accomplishments of the era: music, drawing, needlework, a modest smattering of French conversation. But what these schools actually, functionally taught, whether intentionally or not, was how to form deep, lasting emotional bonds with other women. Young girls typically arrived at boarding school around 12 or 13 years of age and spent the following several formative years immersed in an almost entirely female environment. They studied together, slept together in shared dormitories or paired rooms, ate every meal together, walked together during recreation hours, and spent virtually every single waking moment in exclusively female company. Within this particular environment, genuinely intense friendships weren't merely common. They were, in fact, actively expected. Teachers routinely encouraged girls to form close attachments to one another as part of developing their broader capacity for refined emotional feeling. These particular bonds were framed as valuable preparation for the elevated adult friendships they would go on to maintain later in life. The very same kind of sensibility-drenched relationships so heavily celebrated in the popular literature of the period. Almost no one worried at the time that these particular friendships might become too intense, because the prevailing cultural belief held that female friendship was inherently pure, and therefore fundamentally incapable of the same kind of sexual transgression everyone worried about constantly in relationships between young men and women. This particular environment created something close to a perfect storm for genuine romantic awakening. Girls who were just beginning to understand their own emerging desires found themselves surrounded, day and night, by other girls, in an environment that positively, actively encouraged real emotional intensity. They developed genuine crushes on older students, sometimes on teachers themselves. They formed exclusive, tightly bonded pairs, becoming genuinely inseparable, growing visibly jealous whenever a beloved friend paid too much attention to anyone else. They exchanged locks of hair as tokens, composed private poetry for one another, and carved initials into garden trees during supervised outdoor walks. The surviving letters these young girls wrote one another are, frankly, extraordinary. My own beloved Charlotte, I count every single hour until I see you again, for each moment we spend apart feels stretched into an entire eternity. Dearest Francis, you are my sun, my moon, the very air I breathe. I genuinely cannot imagine any life without you in it. These were never casual, offhand notes exchanged between ordinary classmates. These were declarations of genuinely all-consuming passion. And because they were written between schoolgirls specifically, they were consistently regarded as innocent, even admirable examples of youthful sensibility, rather than as evidence of genuine romantic love taking shape. Physical affection, too, was thoroughly normalized within these school environments. Girls held hands constantly throughout the day, walked together with arms wrapped around each other's waists, sat together during recreation with their heads resting comfortably in each other's laps. They brushed and carefully braided one another's hair, helped each other dress each morning, and frequently shared beds, either officially, when the school itself was genuinely overcrowded, or unofficially, sneaking quietly into a friend's room after the lights had been extinguished for the night. All of this considerable physical intimacy was regarded, without exception, as entirely normal friendship behavior, which meant girls could explore their own developing feelings and desires freely, without any real fear of punishment or lingering suspicion. For a great many women, their very first genuine experience of romantic love occurred during these boarding school years. They fell desperately, completely in love with a particular classmate, experienced the considerable joy of having that love genuinely returned, and eventually learned, often for the first time, exactly what it felt like to have their heart truly broken when a beloved friend graduated, moved away, or formed a new, exclusive attachment to someone else entirely. These formative experiences shaped their broader understanding of love and desire in ways that would go on to affect the entire remainder of their lives. When these women eventually left school behind, they frequently worked hard to maintain their school friendships well into adulthood. They wrote to each other constantly, visited whenever circumstances genuinely allowed, and in a considerable number of cases, eventually moved in together as established adult companions. Former school friends possessed, conveniently, a built-in, entirely respectable explanation for their continued closeness. We have been devoted to one another since our earliest school days. That single explanation made their adult relationship appear to be a perfectly natural extension of innocent youthful friendship, rather than what it more genuinely was, a deliberately, actively chosen romantic partnership. Teachers and older students, too, occasionally formed genuine relationships with younger girls under their supervision. A student might develop intense admiration for a particular teacher, and that teacher might, in turn, respond with special attention, private additional lessons, and eventually a considerably more intimate friendship developing between them. When the student in question eventually graduated, the teacher would sometimes leave her position entirely to become that former student's lifelong companion. These particular relationships carried an obvious, genuinely troubling power imbalance by any modern standard, but they were nonetheless regarded, at the time, as entirely respectable, understood as a natural mentorship gradually evolving into a lifelong bond of genuine devotion. The overall boarding school experience taught countless women, quite directly, that love between women was not merely possible, but genuinely celebrated, provided always that it was properly, carefully framed. Years afterward, when these same women needed to justify their adult romantic friendships to skeptical relatives, they could always point directly back to their shared school days as sufficient explanation. We have simply always been this close. It is genuinely just how the two of us are. The entire boarding school pipeline, in effect, quietly transformed youthful passion into sustained, lifelong partnership. One carefully maintained, carefully justified friendship at a time. Chapter 15. The Governess, Intimacy Born of Inequality. The governess occupied a genuinely strange, liminal social position within any household she served. She was considered too educated, too refined by upbringing to be treated as an ordinary servant, yet too poor, too dependent on her wages to be genuinely welcomed as part of the family itself. She lived within the household day after day, yet never quite belonged fully to it. This particular liminal status left her simultaneously vulnerable and, in a strange sense, largely invisible, a combination that sometimes created genuine space for unexpected relationships to develop with her female employer. A lonely, well-educated woman trapped within a genuinely loveless marriage might well find real companionship, understanding, and considerably more with a governess who happened to share her passion for books and music. It was, unmistakably, a relationship built fundamentally on inequality, but also very often on genuine, authentic connection. And this particular dynamic happened, by all reasonable accounts, considerably more often than most people at the time would have ever cared to openly admit. Governesses were, almost without exception, educated women who had fallen on genuinely hard financial times, daughters of clergymen who died without leaving adequate financial provision, women from once respectable families who had lost their fortune entirely, or simply women who had never married and now needed some reliable means of supporting themselves independently. They were hired specifically to educate the children of wealthier families, yet they occupied a genuine social nowhere within those households, too refined, by their own upbringing, to comfortably eat alongside the servants, yet too poor and dependent to properly dine with the family itself, frequently relegated instead to taking their meals entirely alone in their private room, or else with the children in the nursery. This particular isolation could prove genuinely, deeply lonely, but it also created real opportunities for meaningful connection with the lady of the house herself. A genuinely wealthy woman trapped within a loveless marriage, surrounded by servants she couldn't reasonably befriend, and a husband who largely ignored her, might well find herself drawn steadily toward the household's governess. Here, after all, was someone educated, cultured, and fully capable of intelligent conversation. Everything, in fact, that her husband's own social circle so conspicuously lacked. Everything, in truth, that she herself had been quietly missing for years. They would typically begin by discussing the children's educational progress, but before long, they would find themselves discussing books they had both independently read, exchanging genuine opinions on poetry, gradually discovering an entire range of shared interests neither had expected to find. These particular relationships very often began with genuine innocence. The lady of the house might invite her governess to join her in the drawing room during quiet evening hours. They would play music together at the pianoforte, read aloud to one another, work companionably side by side on embroidery. The governess, genuinely starved for adult companionship and grateful for any real kindness shown by her employer, would visibly blossom under this newfound attention. The lady of the house, equally starved for genuine, meaningful connection within her own marriage, would find herself thinking about the governess constantly, actively looking forward to their shared time together, feeling, for the first time in years, genuinely more alive than she had in a very long while. The power imbalance inherent in these particular relationships was undeniable and genuinely complicated. The lady of the house retained the power to dismiss her governess at any time, for any reason, potentially leaving her without references and effectively unable to secure other suitable employment. The governess, in turn, depended entirely on her employer's continued goodwill for her livelihood and her professional reputation alike. This considerable inequality meant a governess often couldn't realistically refuse her employer's advances, even had she genuinely wished to, though it's equally true that a great many governesses did develop genuine, authentic feelings of their own for their employers, drawn in by real kindness, genuinely shared interests, and the particular intimacy that naturally develops through sustained daily interaction over months and years. Some of these relationships remained largely emotional rather than physical in nature. The two women would form genuinely deep bonds, exchanging meaningful glances across the dinner table, writing each other private notes considerably too affectionate for a strictly professional relationship between employer and employee. They would deliberately create excuses to spend additional time together, arrange their respective daily schedules so their paths would naturally cross more often, and develop precisely the kind of intimate friendship that left the lady's husband vaguely uneasy, without ever being quite suspicious enough to formally object. Other relationships, by contrast, became more overtly, unmistakably romantic. The governess and her employer would arrange to meet secretly, often late at night once the rest of the household had fallen asleep. They exchanged genuine love letters, hidden carefully within books or tucked between sheets of piano music. They stole quiet touches whenever no one else was watching, a brief hand squeeze exchanged in a hallway, a lingering embrace shared in the empty schoolroom. The very real danger of discovery only intensified the relationship further, even as it demanded constant, exhausting vigilance and near-continuous stress. The best possible outcome for these particular relationships, grim as it sounds by modern standards, was typically the death of the lady's husband. Not, unfortunately, an especially uncommon occurrence given the primitive medical practices of the era, which left his widow with genuine financial independence and, crucially, the freedom to retain her governess going forward, not as a paid employee, but as a genuine, chosen companion. The widow would simply announce that dear Miss So-and-so had become such a genuine friend during her period of formal mourning that she had invited her to remain on in an entirely different capacity. The two women could then live together quite openly from that point forward, their continued relationship fully protected by the widow's now unassailable respectability, and by the perfectly acceptable social narrative of companionship. The worst possible outcome, by contrast, was straightforward discovery. A jealous household servant might report suspicious behavior directly to the husband. A young child might innocently mention having seen something they genuinely shouldn't have witnessed. Or, occasionally, the husband himself might simply finally notice, after months or years of quiet inattention, that his wife seemed inexplicably far too attached to her governess. When discovery of this kind occurred, the governess would typically be dismissed immediately, generally without any references whatsoever, making it nearly impossible for her to secure other suitable employment going forward. The wife, meanwhile, would be watched considerably more closely from that point on, perhaps sent away temporarily to stay with distant relatives, or simply forced to endure a noticeably colder, more controlling marriage as a form of ongoing punishment. Despite the very real risks involved, and despite the inherent inequality built into the relationship itself, some governess-employer relationships nonetheless lasted for years, occasionally even for decades. The two women involved navigated the underlying power dynamics as carefully as circumstances allowed, finding whatever ways they genuinely could to care for one another within the real constraints of their respective positions. And in those particular cases where circumstances eventually allowed the two women to live together as genuine equals, through widowhood, through unexpected inheritance, or simply through gradually aging beyond the marriage market's usual concerns, they seized that opportunity, when it finally arrived, to build together the life they had quietly been dreaming of together all along. Chapter 16. Widowhood, the freedom nobody discusses. Widows in Regency England possessed something genuinely rare, and by any reasonable standard precious: real independence. They controlled their own money outright. They made their own decisions without requiring anyone's approval, and critically, they faced no genuine social expectation to remarry if they preferred not to. This particular freedom meant widows could live entirely openly with a female companion without arousing any meaningful suspicion whatsoever. She is still mourning her husband, people would say, entirely sincerely, while the widow in question was, in reality, absolutely not mourning at all, and was, in fact, quite happily settled with her dearest companion in a comfortable cottage by the sea. For a considerable number of women, widowhood turned out to be, quite genuinely, the very best thing that had ever happened to them. The legal and social transformation that occurred the moment a woman's husband died was, by any measure, remarkable. Throughout her marriage, she had effectively been legally invisible in most meaningful respects. Her property belonged, by law, entirely to her husband. Her major decisions required his formal approval. Even her own body was not, in any strict legal sense, entirely her own to command. But widowhood changed all of this virtually overnight. Suddenly she controlled her own jointure, that portion of her late husband's estate specifically designated for her ongoing support, made her own independent financial decisions, and could live wherever she genuinely chose, alongside whomever she genuinely chose to live with. For the very first time in her entire adult life, she existed, in the full legal sense, as a genuine person possessing real agency. Society, naturally, expected widows to mourn appropriately. There were elaborate mourning rituals to observe, specific approved clothing to wear for a designated period, appropriate intervals of social seclusion, and strict, clearly understood rules governing acceptable social engagements during that time. But these very same expectations also, quite conveniently, gave widows a perfectly respectable excuse to withdraw permanently from the marriage market altogether. A widow could simply declare that she had loved her late husband so deeply that any thought of remarriage felt entirely unthinkable, and society would approve wholeheartedly of her evident devotion. It hardly mattered, in practice, if she had actually been genuinely miserable throughout her marriage and was privately delighted to finally be free of it. The mere performance of appropriate grief purchased her a permanent, socially unquestionable exemption from ever having to marry again. This particular arrangement created near-perfect conditions for establishing romantic friendships. A widow who genuinely wished to live with another woman could simply invite her to serve as a companion during this officially difficult period of mourning. People understood, readily and sympathetically, that a grieving woman required real support, comfort, and someone to share her loneliness with. If that particular someone happened to be a woman the widow had, in fact, been quietly in love with for years already, well, how remarkably convenient the timing turned out to be. The companion would move in, ostensibly on a temporary basis, and would then, quite simply, never leave again. After a few years had passed, their shared household would become so thoroughly established and familiar that no one thought to question it any longer. Wealthy widows, in particular, enjoyed even greater freedom still. With genuine financial independence and secure social status behind them, they could travel extensively, maintain their own literary salons, actively patronize the arts, and generally live precisely as they pleased. Many chose deliberately to live alongside other widows, 2 or more women together forming an entirely new household, pooling both their financial resources and their newfound independence. These widow households were widely regarded as simply sensible, practical arrangements, but they also, quietly, created spaces where women could build entire lives centered completely around one another, entirely free from any male oversight or ongoing interference. The widow-companion dynamic proved, in practice, one of the most genuinely stable and consistently long-lasting forms of romantic friendship throughout the entire Regency era. Because both women involved benefited from the social protection afforded by the widow's established status and financial resources, they could weather gossip and any lingering family disapproval considerably more easily than younger, more socially vulnerable women typically could. They could be openly affectionate with one another without raising too many concerned eyebrows. They could make major decisions about their shared life without requiring permission from any father, brother, or husband. They were, in nearly every meaningful sense, as genuinely free as women could reasonably hope to be within that particular era. Some widows specifically deliberately sought out fellow widows as companions, recognizing intuitively that only another woman who had similarly escaped marriage could truly, fully understand the genuine relief and expansive possibility inherent in widowhood itself. They formed partnerships grounded in shared experience, shared independence, and a mutual, firm determination never again to surrender that hard-won independence to any man. These particular widow pairs frequently became genuine fixtures within their local communities, respected, financially comfortable, visibly devoted to one another, and largely untouchable by the ordinary social pressures that continued to constrain considerably younger women. Younger women, meanwhile, sometimes found themselves quietly waiting for eventual widowhood the way others might wait patiently for an expected inheritance. If you happen to be in love with a woman who was already married, your genuine best hope, however uncomfortable to admit, was that her husband might eventually die, freeing her to live with you openly at last. This sounds genuinely morbid when stated plainly, and it undeniably was, but it was also, given the medical realities of the era, entirely realistic. Medicine remained genuinely primitive. Men regularly engaged in dangerous pursuits like hunting, dueling, and warfare, and a great many husbands were significantly older than their wives to begin with. Death, quite simply, was common enough that waiting patiently for eventual widowhood constituted a genuinely viable long-term strategy for some women. Certain relationships that had originally begun as secret affairs between a married woman and her close female friend only became fully open, stable, publicly acknowledged partnerships once the husband in question had, quite conveniently, died. There were also, worth noting, widows who had spent the entirety of their earlier marriages quietly conducting discreet romantic friendships on the side, and who, upon finally achieving widowhood themselves, immediately moved their long-devoted companion into the household without hesitation. These particular women had waited, in some documented cases, literal decades for their eventual freedom, sustaining their genuine love through years of careful letters and occasional stolen visits, always understanding that someday, provided they remained sufficiently patient, they would finally be permitted to live together entirely openly. When that long-awaited day finally arrived, they embraced it, understandably, with considerable relief and genuine joy. And if either woman happened to shed tears during her husband's funeral, those particular tears were, quite likely, considerably more complicated in origin than any of the assembled mourners could possibly have realized. Chapter 17. Dressing the Part. Some women went considerably further still, adopting genuinely masculine clothing, not as any kind of disguise, but rather as a deliberate personal statement in its own right. Eleanor Butler and Sarah Ponsonby famously wore matching riding habits and cravats, as we've already discussed. Other women adopted elements of masculine fashion more privately, or specifically while traveling, where local scrutiny was naturally reduced. This particular choice wasn't invariably connected to sexuality, but very often in practice, it genuinely was. Women's fashion throughout the Regency era was, by design, restrictive in nearly every practical sense. Dresses were deliberately cut to limit natural movement. Narrow skirts made even ordinary walking genuinely difficult. Delicate fabrics couldn't reasonably withstand rough, active use, and the entire ensemble taken together was designed specifically to communicate fragility and decorative femininity above all else. Masculine clothing, by stark contrast, offered something else entirely: genuine practicality, real authority, and considerably greater physical freedom. Men's coats were built sturdy and durable. Men's boots were specifically designed for actual, sustained walking. Men's clothing generally permitted proper horseback riding, considerably more comfortable travel, and genuinely freer movement through the world without constant anxious attention to mud on hemlines or general propriety of appearance. Some women adopted masculine clothing only gradually and only partially at first. They might begin with a riding habit, already somewhat masculine in its basic cut by convention, and then push the style considerably further, adding a cravat, a tailored waistcoat, sturdy men's-style boots. Some cut their hair distinctly shorter than contemporary fashion generally favored for women. They carried walking sticks, favored darker, more severe colors overall, and cultivated a noticeably more austere personal style in general. These particular sartorial choices were typically explained away, when questioned at all, as simply practical or perhaps charmingly eccentric. But they also, quite unmistakably, sent a real signal. In a broader world where gender presentation was rigidly, carefully policed at every turn, even relatively small deviations from expected femininity carried genuine meaning for anyone paying close attention. For some women, masculine dress was explicitly, deliberately about claiming a measure of male privilege for themselves. Dressed convincingly as a man, a woman could travel entirely alone without requiring a chaperone, could enter spaces formerly forbidden to women, could conduct business dealings directly without needing a man to formally represent her interests, and could generally navigate the wider world with considerably more genuine freedom and physical safety than her feminine dress would otherwise permit. Some women deliberately maintained an entirely masculine public persona while reverting comfortably to feminine dress in private, among trusted companions only. Others lived, for extended periods or even permanently, primarily as men, adopting male names and full male identities, revealing their assigned sex only to intimate partners, or occasionally when circumstances like serious illness or death forced the revelation. There are, in fact, several genuinely documented historical cases of women who lived their entire adult lives presenting as men, in some instances even formally marrying other women in the process. These particular relationships remain genuinely complex to interpret through any single modern lens. Were they, in effect, heterosexual marriages in which one partner happened to be secretly female? Were they same-sex relationships in which sustained masculine presentation had simply become a practical necessity for genuine survival? Were they, perhaps, something else entirely, a particular gender and sexual configuration that simply doesn't map cleanly onto any of our modern categories. The surviving historical record rarely offers enough detail to fully resolve these questions with real confidence. But these cases collectively suggest that the Regency era genuinely contained considerably more gender fluidity than the strict, seemingly rigid binary of contemporary fashion and law would otherwise lead us to assume. Masculine dress also, for at least some women, carried a genuine erotic dimension of its own. Some women found masculine clothing itself genuinely arousing, whether wearing it themselves or observing a beloved partner wearing it. There was something quietly transgressive and exciting, for these particular women, about the sight of a woman confidently dressed in men's clothing, something connected directly to the real power and social authority masculine dress conveyed within that era. Women who were genuinely attracted to other women may well have found themselves particularly drawn to those who adopted this kind of masculine presentation, recognizing in them a distinctive blend of qualities that conventional femininity, by its own rigid design, simply couldn't offer. But masculine dress remained throughout a genuinely risky choice for any woman to make. A woman who dressed too visibly, too consistently, mannishly, risked being openly accused of behaving unnaturally, being mocked publicly for attempting to be something she fundamentally wasn't, or being suspected outright of harboring genuinely inappropriate desires. The particular line separating acceptable, charming eccentricity from outright scandalous transgression remained genuinely thin and frustratingly inconsistent from case to case. What was celebrated in one particular woman as bold personal individuality might be harshly condemned as disgraceful affectation in another, depending heavily on her social class, her family connections, and her broader ability to maintain other, more conventional markers of respectability alongside her unconventional dress. For women within romantic friendships specifically, masculine presentation could genuinely serve multiple distinct purposes simultaneously. It could function as a genuine, authentic expression of personal gender identity or preferred self-presentation. It could serve as a straightforwardly practical choice that simply made daily life considerably easier to manage. It could function as a deliberate way of signaling romantic attraction toward other women. Or it could, quite plausibly, be all of these things at once, a genuinely complex ongoing negotiation of identity, desire, and pragmatic survival within a world that held extraordinarily fixed, narrow ideas about precisely how women were expected to look, behave, and love. The women who chose masculine dress regardless, fully aware of the very real risks involved, were making a clear, deliberate statement in doing so. I refuse to perform femininity purely as required of me. I claim for myself whatever freedom masculine presentation genuinely offers, and I will love exactly whom I choose, dressed however I genuinely please. Chapter 18. The Theater and the Arts, Respectability's Own Escape Hatch. The world of theater represented one of the very few professional spheres in which women could realistically hold actual careers, genuine independence, and comparatively real freedom. Actresses, singers, and visual artists all moved within social circles where unconventional relationships were considerably more readily accepted, or at minimum, considerably more openly visible than elsewhere in polite society. Women working within the arts very often lived openly with female companions, collaborated together creatively on shared projects, and formed partnerships that were simultaneously artistic, emotional, and genuinely romantic in nature. The theater itself was never considered part of respectable society in the first place, which meant, quite conveniently, that it was never bound by respectable society's usual rules. And for women who loved other women, that particular lack of conventional respectability functioned in practice as a genuine form of liberation. Respectable society at large generally regarded actresses as only marginally more morally acceptable than prostitutes, a judgment that was, by any fair account, deeply unjust. Acting was, in reality, a legitimate profession demanding real skill, discipline, and genuine talent. But the underlying prejudice was nonetheless real, pervasive, and difficult to escape. Actresses were widely assumed to be sexually available, morally compromised, and generally unsuitable for genuinely polite company. Yet this considerable social stigma carried, alongside its genuine costs, one distinctly unexpected benefit. Actresses had already been placed, by society's own judgment, well beyond the pale of conventional respectability, which meant, in practice, they had genuinely nothing further left to lose by conducting their private lives however they personally chose. Theater companies of the period functioned, in many respects, like traveling extended families, groups of performers who lived and worked closely together, moving from town to town in sequence, sharing lodgings and expenses along the way. Within these particular companies, genuine relationships formed quite organically over time. Two actresses might become genuine partners both on stage and off it, performing convincingly together in front of audiences, and then quietly sharing a bed at the local inn once the performance had concluded. Stage partnerships, in a considerable number of documented cases, either reflected or actively helped create real personal partnerships. The visible chemistry that made certain pairs so convincing as romantic stage leads was, occasionally, genuinely grounded in authentic mutual attraction. The broader artistic world also naturally attracted women who had already been rejected by, or who had themselves deliberately rejected, conventional respectable society. A woman formally disowned by her own family for refusing an arranged marriage might well find genuine acceptance within theatrical circles instead. A woman whose earlier romantic friendship had already been discovered and openly condemned might flee toward the theater specifically, where her particular scandalous past would likely be shrugged off as entirely unremarkable by comparison to the community's own standards. The arts, taken as a whole, became a genuine refuge for women who either couldn't or simply wouldn't conform to conventional expectations. And within that particular refuge, they very often found one another. Female singers and musicians formed similarly close partnerships grounded in genuine creative collaboration. They toured together for extended periods, performed duets together on stage, and lived together comfortably between individual engagements. Their outwardly professional partnership provided convenient, entirely plausible cover for their genuinely personal relationship, while their personal relationship, in turn, very often enhanced the quality of their professional collaborative work. Audiences consistently loved the visible chemistry between celebrated female duet partners, rarely if ever fully realizing that what they were witnessing performed on stage genuinely reflected something considerably deeper happening off it. Visual artists, painters and sculptors alike, enjoyed broadly similar professional opportunities. Women artists frequently hired female models who, over time, became genuine companions, and in a considerable number of documented cases, eventual lovers. The relationship between artist and model was already widely understood to require a certain baseline intimacy, simply by professional necessity. The model spent extended hours alone within the artist's private studio, frequently unclothed for the purposes of the work, creating an environment of genuinely forced physical proximity that could, quite naturally, develop over time into authentic emotional connection. Broader society generally understood artists to be inherently somewhat eccentric by nature, requiring close working relationships with their models simply to complete their professional work. And as long as this particular intimacy remained safely contained within the studio itself, relatively few outside questions were ever seriously raised. The broader bohemian lifestyle commonly associated with working artists also provided genuine practical cover in its own right. Artists were widely expected to live somewhat unconventionally by mainstream standards, to prioritize their creative work and artistic expression over strict social propriety. Two women quietly sharing a modest studio, garret in a considerably less fashionable part of town raised, in practice, noticeably fewer eyebrows than two women from genuinely respectable families choosing to move in together would have provoked. The broader artist identity itself granted these women a kind of implicit social permission to live differently from convention, and that particular permission naturally extended to cover their romantic relationships as well. Of course, the very real freedom offered by the artistic world came bundled together with genuinely significant costs of its own. Women working within the arts were, almost universally, financially precarious, entirely dependent on the frequently unpredictable income generated by individual performances or the occasional sale of their work. They possessed essentially no reliable social safety net to fall back on. Should they eventually become too old, too physically ill, or simply too professionally unpopular to continue working, they had no family support structure remaining to fall back on for assistance. They remained genuinely vulnerable throughout their careers to exploitation, harassment, and outright poverty. The real freedom to love openly, in this particular world, came at a genuinely significant price measured in security and conventional respectability alike. But for a great many women working within this world, that particular trade-off proved genuinely worthwhile. Within the theater and the broader arts more generally, they could finally be themselves in ways that would have proven simply impossible within conventional society's tighter constraints. They could love openly, could live comfortably with their chosen partners without needing to constantly construct elaborate justifying excuses, and could build entire lives centered firmly around genuine creativity and authentic passion, rather than duty and rigid propriety. They might well remain poor, socially disreputable in the eyes of polite society, and openly looked down upon by respectable circles more broadly, but they were, in every meaningful sense that mattered to them personally, genuinely free. And for women who had once truly tasted that particular freedom, there was, in most documented cases, no meaningful going back to the confining prison of conventional respectability afterward. Chapter 19. Invisible in the Eyes of the Law. Here is perhaps the single most genuinely surprising fact underlying this entire history. Regency England essentially had no formal legal concept of lesbianism whatsoever, whether as a recognized identity or as a defined medical condition. While male homosexuality was formally criminalized throughout the period, and could, in the most severe cases, be punished by death, relationships between women were, by stark contrast, almost entirely ignored by the formal legal system altogether. Why the striking discrepancy? Because a great many people at the time, particularly men in positions of legal and social authority, simply couldn't genuinely conceive of women possessing sexual desire that existed independently of male involvement altogether. This particular ignorance, insulting as its underlying assumption clearly was, nonetheless created a genuine, functional loophole. As long as women never explicitly named what they were actually doing together, society, in the most literal sense, simply lacked any conceptual framework for recognizing it at all. Out of sight, effectively out of mind, and very much entirely out of the courtroom. The legal invisibility of relationships between women wasn't, it's worth being clear, any kind of progressive oversight or deliberate tolerance on society's part. It was rooted, quite directly, in deeply sexist underlying assumptions about the fundamental nature of women's sexuality more broadly. The prevailing medical and philosophical understanding of the period held that women were, by their essential nature, largely passive sexual beings, capable of responding to male desire, but not genuinely capable of experiencing autonomous sexual desire of their own. Since authentic sexual activity was understood, by this particular logic, to necessarily require a penis, two women together simply couldn't, according to the prevailing worldview, be engaging in anything genuinely sexual at all. They might well be engaged in some form of vague, intense romantic friendship, but without a man's direct involvement, there was, in the era's own internal logic, no genuine sexual activity occurring, and therefore, by extension, no crime, no meaningful sin, no real problem requiring formal legal attention whatsoever. This considerable medical erasure meant there was, in practical terms, essentially no established vocabulary available for female same-sex desire anywhere within mainstream discourse of the period. Medical texts might occasionally, in passing, mention women displaying what was termed excessive attachment to one another, or exhibiting certain masculine tendencies, but these particular observations were consistently treated as passing medical curiosities, or as isolated symptoms of hysteria, rather than as evidence of any coherent, recognized sexual identity in its own right. Doctors of the period simply didn't diagnose lesbianism as such, primarily because they genuinely didn't believe such a condition meaningfully existed, regarding these women instead as merely confused, requiring nothing more than appropriate marriage to a suitable man to properly correct their apparent confusion. The comparatively rare instances in which relationships between women did formally enter legal or medical discourse of the period generally involved specific cases where one woman had been actively passing as a man in public life. If a woman dressed convincingly as a man and went on to formally marry another woman under these circumstances, she might well face genuine legal prosecution, not notably because two women had formed a relationship with one another, but rather because the masculine-presenting woman had committed outright fraud by falsely presenting herself as male throughout the deception. The underlying legal crime in these specific cases was understood to be gender transgression combined with deliberate deception, not, crucially, same-sex love itself as an independent concept. As long as both women involved continued to present openly as women throughout, the law, quite simply, possessed no meaningful framework whatsoever for understanding or formally regulating their relationship. This particular legal and medical blind spot created genuine space for women to love one another, without facing anything remotely approaching the violent, state-sanctioned persecution that men who loved men faced consistently throughout the same period. Two women could, in principle, live together openly for 50 full years, share a single bed throughout, declare passionate, unmistakable love for one another in surviving letters and diaries, and never once need to genuinely fear being formally arrested, put on trial, or executed for their relationship. The worst realistic consequence they typically faced was social disapproval, ordinary gossip, or sustained family pressure toward eventual separation. These were undoubtedly serious consequences in their own right, but nothing remotely comparable to the very real legal death penalty that hung, quite literally, over male same-sex relationships throughout the same historical period. Of course, this particular invisibility carried a genuinely darker underlying cost as well, because female same-sex desire simply wasn't recognized as authentically real within the broader culture. Women themselves often couldn't properly name or fully understand their own genuine feelings using any framework readily available to them at the time. A woman who found herself exclusively attracted to other women possessed, quite literally, no established language for articulating her own experience, no broader community she could reasonably turn to for understanding, no cultural narrative anywhere that genuinely reflected her actual lived experience back to her. She might well have believed, for years or even decades, that she was entirely alone in feeling this way, might have come to believe she was somehow sick, or sinful, or fundamentally broken, might have lived out an entire lifetime without ever fully understanding that what she genuinely felt was, quite simply, love. The broader medical establishment's underlying ignorance also meant that When doctors of the period did occasionally notice unusually intense attachments developing between particular women, they frequently pathologized these attachments in strange, deeply indirect ways. A woman who firmly refused to marry, remaining instead devoted entirely to her female friend, might well be formally diagnosed with hysteria, with vague nervous disorders, or with a generalized overabundance of sensibility. The prescribed treatment invariably focused on making her, somehow, more conventionally feminine, more genuinely marriageable, more actively interested in men, never once acknowledging, even implicitly, that the actual underlying issue was her genuine attraction to women specifically, because the treating doctors themselves genuinely couldn't quite bring themselves to seriously entertain that particular possibility. There were, on occasion, isolated moral panics that flared briefly within specific local communities, but these remained genuinely rare occurrences and almost invariably stayed strictly localized in scope. A particularly visible, difficult-to-overlook romantic friendship might well scandalize one small community for a season, generating considerable local gossip, temporary social exclusion, or renewed family pressure toward eventual separation of the two women involved. But these particular localized panics never reached the level of genuine national concern, and never resulted in any meaningful formal legal reform, specifically targeting relationships between women. Unlike male homosexuality, which remained subject throughout the period to periodic, genuinely severe waves of active prosecution and widespread public hysteria, relationships between women remained, throughout, stubbornly, persistently invisible to both the formal legal and medical establishments alike. This particular invisibility functioned, in practice, as simultaneously a genuine blessing and a genuine curse. It allowed women who loved other women to remain largely undetected, quietly building entire lives together without ever facing the kind of formal legal persecution men in comparable situations routinely confronted. But this same invisibility also meant these women remained, throughout, entirely unprotected by any formal legal framework whatsoever. If a family decided, for whatever reason, to forcibly separate two women in a relationship, there existed no meaningful legal recourse available to either woman. If they were formally declared mad and subsequently confined against their will, no lawyer of the period could realistically mount a defense by arguing their relationship was, in fact, natural, legitimate, and worthy of formal legal protection. They existed, throughout the entire period, in a genuine legal gray zone, never formally criminalized, yet never genuinely recognized either, protected in practice only by widespread ignorance, and simultaneously abandoned entirely by that very same ignorance, the moment real protection was actually needed. Chapter 20. When Love Ended. Not every romantic friendship of this period ended happily or even peacefully. Women, quite naturally, occasionally fell out of love with one another over time. They grew genuinely jealous. They were forcibly separated by determined family pressure. Some relationships concluded in genuinely dramatic public arguments, in burned letters, in two women who had once shared everything now refusing ever to speak to one another again. Others faded away considerably more quietly, with one woman eventually marrying a man after all, and the other retreating gradually into permanent solitude. The genuine emotional stakes involved were every bit as high as in any conventional heterosexual relationship of the period. But crucially, without any established social script whatsoever for how to properly navigate an eventual breakup. You couldn't, after all, realistically tell your own mother, "My beloved companion has genuinely broken my heart." Or rather, you could say precisely that, but she would very likely simply conclude you needed a strong cup of tea and an early night's rest. Genuine jealousy within these romantic friendships could prove intense and genuinely all-consuming. Because these particular relationships were never officially, formally recognized by the broader society around them, there existed no clear established boundaries, no genuine expectation of exclusivity that either woman could reasonably invoke. If a beloved friend began forming a notably close new attachment to someone else entirely, the other woman possessed no socially acceptable way whatsoever to openly object. She couldn't reasonably say, "You are being unfaithful to me," because doing so would require openly admitting the true romantic nature of their relationship in the first place. Instead, she would typically suffer largely in silence, watching, helplessly, as the woman she loved grew steadily closer to someone new, entirely unable to name her own genuine pain without simultaneously exposing herself to considerable risk. Some women responded to this particular jealousy by becoming visibly controlling or emotionally demanding. They would insist on near-constant attention from their companion, openly object whenever their friend spent meaningful time with anyone else, and create genuinely dramatic emotional scenes whenever they felt neglected in any way. But because intense emotional displays were already broadly expected between close female friends of the period, this particular behavior was frequently simply tolerated, or even quietly admired as further evidence of especially deep feeling, rather than being correctly recognized as the genuine possessiveness it actually represented. Other women within their broader social circle would watch these dramatic scenes unfold and think only, how remarkably devoted the two of them clearly are, never once realizing they were, in fact, witnessing a genuine, full-blown romantic crisis playing out in front of them. Breakups, when they occurred, happened for a considerable range of underlying reasons. Sometimes, quite simply, genuine feelings faded naturally over time, exactly as they do within any long-term relationship. The passionate attachment that had once seemed genuinely eternal at 20 years of age could come to feel, by 30, uncomfortably suffocating instead. Sometimes external family pressure simply became too much to sustain over time. Families occasionally threatened formal disinheritance. Local communities occasionally gossiped with genuine cruelty. One woman, eventually, might simply find herself unable to continue bearing the ongoing strain of sustained secrecy. Sometimes one woman genuinely wished to marry a man after all, either because she authentically preferred men to begin with, or because she couldn't ultimately face a lifetime of continued social marginalization, and genuinely wanted the security and social acceptance that formal marriage reliably offered. When these particular relationships did end, the resulting emotional devastation was every bit as genuine and profound as in any conventional heterosexual breakup. Yet women possessed no established vocabulary whatsoever for properly expressing it. They couldn't reasonably mourn openly, or seek genuine sympathy from friends who might actually understand the true magnitude of what they had lost. Instead, they were forced to pretend they were simply, mildly sad about losing a particularly dear friend, deliberately downplaying the true depth of their genuine grief in order to keep it socially acceptable to those around them. They wept alone in their private rooms, reread old letters privately, and slowly attempted to rebuild lives that now felt genuinely hollow without the woman they had truly loved. Some breakups turned genuinely bitter and vengeful in their aftermath. Letters were deliberately burned. Gifts, once treasured, were formally returned. Mutual friends found themselves genuinely forced to choose sides between the two women. Women who had once shared literally everything with one another suddenly became complete strangers, unable even to comfortably remain in the same room together. Sometimes this particular anger sprang directly from genuine hurt. One woman had once promised they would never willingly part, only to eventually marry a wealthy man and move away entirely, leaving her former companion feeling genuinely bereft and betrayed. Sometimes the anger instead reflected authentic underlying conflict, genuine personality clashes that had been comfortably overlooked during the passionate early days of the relationship, but which gradually became genuinely unbearable as real time passed. The broader lack of social recognition afforded these relationships also meant there existed, quite literally, no established protocol whatsoever for navigating an eventual breakup. Married couples who separated, a genuinely rare occurrence in itself during this period, at least had established legal and social processes available to follow. But two women ending a long-standing romantic friendship together had to work out every single practical detail entirely on their own. Who retained the shared furniture accumulated over years together? Who remained in the rented house they had shared? How precisely did they explain the sudden, unexpected end of a friendship that everyone around them had simply assumed would last forever? These considerable practical challenges only compounded the already substantial emotional ones. There were also, worth noting, relationships that never truly ended in any dramatic sense, but instead gradually faded into something else entirely over time. The intensely romantic early phase would slowly give way to a considerably more comfortable, settled companionship, still genuinely loving in its own way, but no longer particularly passionate. Or two women might come to realize over time that they genuinely functioned better together as close friends than as romantic partners, and would consciously, deliberately transform their relationship accordingly, while continuing to live together and care for one another regardless. These particular transitions could prove genuinely healthy and entirely mutual in nature, but they could equally prove quietly heartbreaking for whichever woman still felt genuine romantic love, even as her partner had already moved on emotionally. Some women never truly recovered from their first great love. They spent decades living entirely alone afterward, never forming another romantic friendship again, perpetually comparing everyone they subsequently met against the woman who had once left them. They kept old letters carefully hidden away for the remainder of their lives, rereading them privately on meaningful anniversaries, carrying the persistent memory of that lost love with them throughout their entire remaining lifetime. Others, by contrast, threw themselves immediately into new relationships, genuinely desperate to fill the sudden void left behind, eager to prove to themselves that they remained capable of loving and of being genuinely loved in return. The complete absence of any established social script for these particular breakups meant women were forced, in every single case, to navigate their own genuine grief and eventual healing entirely on their own individual terms. They couldn't reasonably approach friends for advice about recovering from heartbreak without first admitting openly what the underlying relationship had actually been. They couldn't reasonably seek comfort from family members who would simply, unhelpfully, tell them they would eventually find someone new. They suffered in the overwhelming majority of documented cases, largely in silence, their genuine pain remaining invisible and formally unacknowledged, their real loss left permanently unnamed, and therefore, in practice, genuinely impossible to properly, fully mourn. And yet, as people invariably do, they survived regardless, finding their own individual ways to heal from a particular kind of heartbreak that had, quite literally, no established name, and moved forward eventually into futures that might, if they could bring themselves to risk it again, hold genuine love once more. Chapter 21: Faith and the Vocabulary of Devotion. Christianity throughout the Regency era was woven deeply into the fabric of everyday life, and it maintained, throughout, a genuinely complicated relationship with love between women. On the one hand, certain religious texts formally condemned specific acts outright. On the other hand, the broader language of religious devotion itself, passionate, deeply intimate, genuinely all-consuming in its expressed intensity, closely mirrored the very same language used to describe romantic friendship more generally. Women could express profound, genuine love for one another using explicitly biblical metaphors and established spiritual vocabulary, effectively cloaking authentic desire beneath a comfortable layer of conventional piety. A phrase like, "She is my very soul's true companion," sounded entirely, appropriately holy on its surface, even when what a woman genuinely meant was something considerably closer to, I would willingly die for her, and I would also very much like to kiss her. The Bible itself contains several well-known examples of genuinely intense same-sex bonds that devout religious women could readily point to as established precedent for their own relationships. The story of Ruth and Naomi proved a particularly consistent favorite. Ruth's famous declaration to Naomi, "Where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge," was quoted endlessly in letters exchanged between women who genuinely loved one another. The relationship between David and Jonathan offered a comparable male biblical parallel, their mutual love explicitly described within Scripture as surpassing the love of women. These particular biblical friendships provided both a genuine template and a ready-made theological justification. If sacred Scripture itself openly celebrated this kind of profound devotion between two people of the same sex, then surely, the reasoning went, contemporary romantic friendships between women were equally godly in nature. Religious language throughout the period was, more broadly, intensely emotional and often surprisingly physical in ways that provided genuinely perfect cover for expressing romantic love more directly. Popular hymns of the era spoke openly of being ravished by divine love, of burning with genuine spiritual passion, of individual souls uniting with God in mystical marriage. Women readily adopted this same rich vocabulary to describe their own feelings toward one another, writing lines like, "My very soul burns constantly for union with yours," or simply, "I am utterly consumed by love for you." Such phrases could reasonably be read as either sincere spiritual devotion or genuine romantic desire, entirely depending on the specific context in which they appeared. This particular ambiguity was, in many documented cases, both entirely intentional and genuinely strategic on the writer's part. Convents and other formal religious communities also provided genuine spaces where women who loved women could live together with real legitimacy in the eyes of broader society. Taking formal religious vows meant explicitly rejecting marriage altogether, dedicating oneself instead to God. But it also meant, in practice, living within tightly knit, exclusively female communities, where intensely close friendships were both entirely common and frequently actively encouraged by the surrounding religious culture. Individual nuns often maintained particular friendships that everyone within the community knew about and generally accepted without comment, provided these particular friendships were consistently framed in terms of spiritual sisterhood rather than romantic attachment. Some of these particular friendships were, quite genuinely, entirely platonic in nature. Others, by contrast, served as effective cover for relationships that closely resembled genuine marriages in every practical respect. The considerable emphasis placed on celibacy within formal religious life actually made it genuinely easier for some women to avoid marriage altogether without arousing any real suspicion. A woman could simply declare that she had formally consecrated her virginity to God and was therefore permanently unable to marry, and her own family would generally feel obligated to respect that particular decision, even if they weren't entirely happy about it privately. If she subsequently chose to live alongside another woman who had made an identical religious declaration, the two of them could reasonably frame their shared household as a kind of informal religious community. Two genuinely pious women mutually supporting one another in their shared devotion to God. However, religion could equally be weaponized against women who loved other women when circumstances required it. When families genuinely wanted to separate two romantic friends, they could readily invoke religious authority directly, claiming the friendship in question had become excessive, spiritually unwholesome, and therefore genuinely sinful in nature. Priests or ministers might be formally brought in specifically to counsel the two women regarding the proper theological distinction between acceptable Christian friendship and genuinely dangerous attachment. Religious language concerning sin, temptation, and moral purity could be readily deployed as a weapon, designed specifically to make women feel genuine guilt about their authentic feelings and established relationships. Some women fully internalized these particular religious messages and struggled, sometimes for years, with genuine, deep guilt surrounding their own desires. They believed sincerely that they loved God, while also loving another woman in ways that felt, to them personally, genuinely sinful. They prayed earnestly for deliverance from these particular feelings, performed genuine penance for thoughts they believed to be impure, and tormented themselves attempting to properly distinguish between acceptable sisterly affection and what they understood to be forbidden desire. This particular internal conflict could prove genuinely agonizing, especially for deeply devout women who authentically wish to live according to established religious principles, even as their genuine hearts kept leading them, again and again, toward other women. Other women, by contrast, firmly rejected the underlying premise that their love was somehow inherently sinful. They argued, sometimes quite openly, though more often simply internally, that God Himself had made them this particular way, that their genuine capacity to love so deeply was itself divine in origin, and that a love this powerful and this genuinely pure simply couldn't possibly be evil in any meaningful sense. They developed their own personal theological justifications over time, actively reinterpreting Scripture to genuinely support their relationships, rather than condemn them outright. These particular women developed their own coherent spiritual frameworks that allowed them to remain genuinely Christian while also loving other women, without feeling permanently torn between these two aspects of themselves. Religious communities, in practice, could prove surprisingly tolerant of romantic friendships, provided these relationships were conducted with sufficient discretion. A single parish might well contain 2 or 3 separate pairs of women widely known to be devoted companions, living together, attending church services together, participating jointly in local charitable works together. As long as these women continued to fulfill their expected religious and broader social obligations, attended services regularly, and maintained an appropriate outward appearance of respectability, the surrounding church community would generally, quietly accept them without further comment. The unspoken rule governing this particular arrangement ran something close to, "We will not ask, and you, in turn, will not tell, and everyone involved can continue comfortably pretending that everything remains entirely proper." The broader religious framework of the Regency era proved, in the end, deeply contradictory in nearly every respect relevant to same-sex love during this particular period. It simultaneously provided both language and genuine justification for intensely close bonds between women, while also, at times, actively condemning those very same bonds. It created genuine spaces where women could live together under legitimate religious auspices, while simultaneously threatening spiritual punishment for what it separately defined as same-sex desire. Women navigated these considerable contradictions as skillfully as they genuinely could, drawing on religion whenever it served their purposes, actively reinterpreting it whenever circumstances required, and quietly, deliberately ignoring whatever particular portions condemned what they already knew in their own hearts to be genuine love. Chapter 22. Travel, the ultimate available cover. One of the genuinely greatest privileges afforded by a stable romantic friendship was the real freedom to travel together extensively. 2 women touring the European continent, visiting fashionable spa towns, or simply taking long, unhurried walks through the English countryside raised, in practice, remarkably few eyebrows anywhere. Travel offered genuine freedom from the constant watchful eyes of family and community alike, real opportunities for meaningful privacy, and the considerable thrill of authentic adventure. Some women effectively planned their entire lives around sustained travel, moving steadily from place to place together, always as a pair. It was, in effect, the Regency-era equivalent of dramatically running away together, except that instead of literally running, you simply hired a rather slow carriage and stopped frequently along the way for tea. Travel represented one of the very few areas of life in which women could genuinely experience real personal autonomy, and traveling alongside a trusted female companion was considered not merely acceptable, but practically required by convention. A woman traveling entirely alone was widely regarded as suspicious, physically vulnerable, and generally socially unacceptable. But a woman traveling alongside her devoted companion, that particular arrangement was considered thoroughly respectable, entirely sensible, and even admirable in its own right. The very companion system that constrained women so significantly in countless other areas of daily life actually, quite ironically, enabled them to move through the wider world together, creating a genuinely reliable, built-in excuse for sustained physical proximity over extended periods. The traditional grand tour, historically reserved almost exclusively for wealthy young men completing their education, became increasingly accessible during this period to women of independent means who traveled together in pairs or small groups. Two women might reasonably spend several months, or even multiple years, touring the European continent together. Paris, Rome, Venice, the Swiss Alps, visiting art galleries, attending the opera regularly, studying foreign languages, and experiencing cultures dramatically different from the considerably more restrictive society they had left behind in England. Within these particular foreign settings, genuinely removed from family oversight and the tight social networks that governed daily life at home, they could be considerably more openly affectionate with one another, more authentically themselves, entirely free from the constant surveillance they routinely faced back home. Fashionable spa towns proved particularly popular destinations for women in romantic friendship specifically. Bath, Cheltenham, and later, various European spa destinations such as Baden-Baden became genuine gathering places for women ostensibly seeking the therapeutic mineral waters for their health. This convenient medical pretext gave women an entirely legitimate reason to spend extended weeks or months away from home, and the broader spa culture itself remained relaxed enough that two women traveling together could comfortably share accommodations, take long walks together at dawn, and spend extended hours together without anyone finding the arrangement remotely unusual. The genuinely therapeutic atmosphere of these particular spa towns also attracted women who were explicitly fleeing difficult marriages or oppressive family situations, transforming these destinations into genuine havens for women actively seeking a different kind of life altogether. The straightforwardly practical aspects of travel also naturally drew women considerably closer together over time. Sharing a single room at any given inn was both genuinely economical and entirely expected by convention. Helping one another dress and undress, sharing a bed simply for warmth, occasionally bathing together when communal facilities were the only option available. All of this created a considerable degree of constant physical intimacy that was, on its surface, entirely justified by simple practicality, yet could quite easily develop into something considerably more meaningful. The long, unhurried hours spent together inside a slow-moving carriage gave women genuine time for deep, extended conversation, for reading aloud to one another, for precisely the kind of sustained, undivided attention that proved considerably harder to achieve amid the busy, crowded social life typical of home. Some women effectively became perpetual travelers over time, never quite settling permanently anywhere for very long. They would rent seasonal lodgings in one particular town, then move steadily onward to the next town, the next country entirely, always offering some entirely plausible reason for the move: the local climate, the surrounding culture, the particular local society. But the genuine underlying reason, more often than not, was simply that constant movement itself offered them real freedom. As strangers arriving fresh in each new place, they weren't bound by the accumulated local knowledge and social expectations that home communities inevitably imposed over time. They could present themselves however they genuinely wished, could effectively reinvent their shared story with each subsequent move, and could avoid the sustained, long-term scrutiny that might otherwise eventually see through their carefully maintained fiction. Surviving travel writing and letters sent home from these particular journeys reveal, quite clearly, the genuine joy and real freedom these women experienced. They wrote, naturally, about the landscapes they encountered, but also, just as consistently, about the sheer pleasure of simply being together, of sharing new experiences side by side, of discovering unfamiliar places in each other's company. We climbed together to the very summit of the mountain, hand in hand the entire way, and stood there feeling as though we were genuinely the only two people remaining in the entire world, one woman wrote home. The language itself reads as unmistakably romantic, because the underlying experience genuinely was romantic. Travel transformed ordinary daily life into real adventure, lending even the most mundane individual moments a heightened intensity they simply lacked back home. There were, admittedly, darker aspects to travel as well. Two women traveling entirely alone remained genuinely vulnerable to robbery, physical assault, and exploitation by unscrupulous innkeepers or hired guides along the way. They faced real language barriers in unfamiliar countries, unfamiliar local customs, and the constant, ongoing challenge of maintaining an appropriate degree of respectability within foreign contexts, where the established local rules weren't always entirely clear to outsiders. Some women found themselves genuinely stranded without adequate funds when expected money failed to arrive on schedule, or fell seriously ill in places where reliable medical care remained genuinely primitive, and they had no family present locally to properly advocate on their behalf. But for women who loved women specifically, these very real risks were, in the overwhelming majority of documented cases, considered genuinely worth accepting. Travel offered something that simply remaining at home could never realistically provide: the genuine possibility of living life entirely on one's own terms, even if only temporarily, for the duration of a single extended journey. Every new journey undertaken represented a genuine escape. Every unfamiliar new place offered a fresh chance to be truly free. Every shared hotel room became, in effect, a private space where the two women could finally set aside the constant performance required at home and simply, quietly, be together. And when they eventually returned home again, if they did return at all, they carried those particular memories with them permanently. Genuine proof that another kind of life was authentically possible, and that they had, at least once, genuinely tasted real freedom and survived the experience intact. Chapter 23. What the Diaries genuinely reveal. A great many Regency women kept detailed, sustained private diaries, and a meaningful number of these particular diaries have survived into the present day, offering us genuinely tantalizing glimpses into their authentic inner emotional lives. The surviving entries range widely in tone, from the genuinely poignant, "I find I truly cannot bear to be parted from her," to the openly ecstatic, "She kissed me, and for one moment I genuinely believed my heart might simply burst from joy," to the truly heartbreaking, "They are actively forcing us apart, and I scarcely know how I shall bear it." These particular diaries were never intended for any form of publication or wider readership. They constitute genuinely private records of authentically private feelings. Yet now, viewed from a considerable historical distance of well over 2 centuries, they stand as genuine evidence that these particular relationships were entirely real, deeply felt, and in the end, genuinely undeniable. The women who actually lived these experiences knew, with real clarity, exactly what these relationships were to them, even lacking, as they did, the precise contemporary vocabulary we ourselves now use to describe such bonds. Diaries offered these women a genuinely rare space in which to be completely, entirely honest with themselves. Within their letters, they were required to maintain at least some baseline level of conventional propriety, always genuinely aware that their correspondence might potentially be read by watchful family members or intercepted along the way by suspicious relatives. In ordinary daily conversation, they were required to consistently perform the accepted fiction of purely platonic friendship. But within the private pages of their own diaries, carefully locked away with small personal keys, or simply hidden beneath a mattress, women could finally name their genuine feelings directly, without translation, without requiring any convenient excuse, without the careful coded language required virtually everywhere else in their daily lives. The language recorded within these particular diaries often reads as genuinely, startlingly explicit, not generally in any sexually explicit sense, but rather in a considerably more emotionally raw sense that can genuinely catch a modern reader entirely off guard. "I love her with absolutely every fiber of my entire being," one woman recorded plainly. "The thought of any future life without her feels genuinely unbearable to me. I believe I would rather die outright than ever be permanently separated from her." Another woman recorded, with similar directness, "We lay together last night, and I experienced such genuine joy, such profound completeness as I have honestly never known before in my entire life. She is, quite simply, my everything, my whole world, my very heart." These are not, by any reasonable reading, vague or ambiguous expressions of ordinary friendship. They constitute, quite clearly, genuine declarations of authentic romantic, and very possibly erotic, love. Some particular diaries carefully track the gradual development of a specific relationship day by day, reading almost like a genuine romance novel, unfolding in real time as events actually occurred. A woman might record the exact first moment she genuinely noticed her friend's physical beauty, the precise moment she first realized her own feelings extended considerably beyond ordinary friendship, the mixture of genuine terror and exhilaration involved in privately wondering whether these particular feelings might actually be returned. She documented, with real care, every meaningful touch, every significant glance exchanged, every single conversation that seemed, in the moment, unusually charged with unspoken feeling. Reading these particular entries today, at this considerable historical distance, one can genuinely feel the mounting tension building steadily across the pages, the relationship developing in real time, the precise moment at which both women finally, openly acknowledged exactly what they genuinely meant to one another. Diaries also carefully recorded the countless small, everyday intimacies that formal letters could never quite fully capture. "Helped her arrange her hair again this morning. Her neck is so genuinely lovely that I could scarcely properly concentrate on the task at hand. We walked together in the garden afterward, and she took my arm as we walked, and I felt such genuine warmth spread steadily through me at her touch. She read aloud to me again this evening while I worked at my needlework, and I found myself watching, quite helplessly, the particular shape her mouth made as she formed each word, rather than genuinely attending to the actual story she was reading." These particular small, seemingly unremarkable moments, barely worth mentioning aloud to anyone else, were nonetheless considered valuable enough to carefully record for posterity, genuine evidence of love expressed quietly through the entirely mundane routines of a fully shared daily life. Genuine conflict and jealousy appear regularly within these particular diary pages as well. "She spent the entire evening deep in conversation with Miss Hartley and scarcely looked once in my direction the whole time. I am, quite honestly, in genuine agony over it. I fear she may be growing genuinely tired of my company. She has seemed distracted lately, somehow distant from me. Have I perhaps done something to displease her? I saw her walking again with Miss Hartley this afternoon. I genuinely cannot bear this particular situation any longer. I will not simply share her affection with another." The considerable emotional volatility recorded here feels entirely, recognizably human, the genuine insecurity, the visible possessiveness, the desperate underlying need for reassurance that reliably characterizes early romantic love, entirely regardless of which particular genders happen to be involved. The genuinely most heartbreaking diary entries that survive from this period are, without much doubt, those specifically recording forced separations imposed by disapproving families. Women wrote, in these particular passages, of being violently torn away from their beloved companions by relatives who had finally recognized what was actually happening between them and had decided, at last, to formally intervene. They are sending me away entirely, to stay indefinitely with my aunt in Yorkshire. I begged them, I pleaded with them at genuine length, but father remains entirely resolute in his decision. I will very likely never see her again in this life. My own life, in every meaningful sense, feels genuinely finished now. Mother burned all of her letters today, directly in front of me as I watched helplessly. She insisted it was genuinely for my own good, that I had been developing what she termed an unhealthy attachment. I feel, quite honestly, as though she has murdered something genuinely precious and entirely irreplaceable within me. These particular entries very often simply end abruptly mid-thought, the diary itself apparently abandoned altogether, because the woman writing it had genuinely lost the will to continue recording a life that no longer felt to her remotely worth documenting. But there are equally, thankfully, genuinely joyful entries preserved as well, entire pages filled with real gratitude and quiet wonder. We have finally decided together to establish our own household. I can scarcely believe my own considerable good fortune, to spend literally every single day in her company, to wake each morning beside her, to fully share my entire life with her at last. It is, quite honestly, more than I ever genuinely dared to hope for. Today marks precisely 1 full year since we first established our shared household together, 1 entire year of a happiness I genuinely never imagined possible for myself before. I feel, quite simply, blessed well beyond measure. These particular entries glow, even now, with real contentment, with the quiet, settled joy of a woman who has genuinely found precisely what she needed all along. Scholars who study these particular surviving diaries today inevitably face a genuine challenge of proper interpretation. How precisely should we read these repeated declarations of profound love? Are they genuinely romantic, in the fully modern sense we now understand that term? Or do they simply represent examples of the intensely close, yet ultimately platonic friendships that were, by all accounts, genuinely common throughout this particular era? The honest answer, frustratingly enough, is that we can rarely ever be entirely certain in any individual case. The women themselves may never have drawn especially clear distinctions between romantic love and platonic love in their own minds, or they may have drawn distinctions that simply remain genuinely invisible to us now, at this considerable historical remove. What we can say with genuine confidence is this: these particular relationships mattered enormously to the women who lived them. The emotions carefully recorded were entirely real and genuinely powerful, and simply reducing these bonds to mere friendship risks erasing something genuinely fundamental about the actual lived experiences these women were so carefully describing. The particular diaries that have survived into the present day almost certainly represent only a small fraction of what once genuinely existed. A great many were undoubtedly destroyed by the women themselves before their own deaths, or by scandalized surviving family members immediately afterward, or by archivists who simply didn't consider them worth the effort of formal preservation, or simply lost entirely to the ordinary ravages of time and pure accident. The particular diaries that have managed to survive represent genuinely precious historical artifacts, authentic windows into lives that were, in every real sense, supposed to remain permanently private. They demonstrate with real clarity that women throughout the Regency era loved one another deeply, passionately, honestly, and with full, genuine awareness of exactly what they were feeling, even lacking, as they inevitably did, any established public language to name that feeling openly at the time. Chapter 24. A Life Built Without Men at its Center. One of the genuinely most quietly radical aspects of these romantic friendships was simply how little they centered men at all. In a broader world where women's entire lives were formally expected to revolve constantly around fathers, brothers, and eventual husbands, these particular relationships created genuine spaces in which men became, in practice, largely irrelevant. Two women could build an entire shared life together, emotionally, intellectually, domestically, without a single man playing any meaningful role in that life whatsoever. It represented, in its own quiet way, a genuine form of resistance, a way of communicating without ever stating it directly, "We simply do not need you." And for women who had spent their entire lives being consistently told they absolutely needed men in order to live full, complete lives, that particular realization proved genuinely revolutionary. The entire underlying social structure of Regency England rested firmly on the basic assumption that women existed primarily in relation to men. You were understood, first and foremost, as someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's eventual wife. Your fundamental value was measured almost exclusively by your marriageability, or by your broader usefulness in maintaining and extending male family lineages. Your property, in nearly every practical sense, ultimately belonged to the men within your own family. Your physical body remained, throughout your life, subject to established male authority in one form or another. Even your friendships with other women were very often framed, implicitly, as either preparation for your eventual relationships with men, or as a kind of emotional supplement to those relationships. You were understood to be learning how to become a good future wife, or simply finding necessary emotional outlets your eventual husband would presumably fail to provide. But romantic friendships genuinely disrupted this entire underlying framework. Two women who deliberately chose one another were, in effect, creating a genuine primary attachment that had absolutely nothing to do with men whatsoever. They weren't simply waiting patiently for eventual husbands, weren't settling for each other's company merely in the temporary absence of available male partners, weren't using one another as some kind of substitute for the real relationships they would presumably eventually have with men instead. They were choosing one another quite deliberately, quite actively, as their genuine primary life partners going forward. All of this amounted, in effect, to a genuine rejection of the fundamental organizing principle underlying their entire society. The particular domestic spaces these women created together were, by design, genuinely female-centered in ways that were, for the period, unusual and quietly subversive in their broader implications. Within a typical Regency household, even one where the wife handled most day-to-day domestic operations personally, the husband remained the recognized legal head of the household, the ultimate practical authority, the person whose particular needs and preferences structured everyone else's daily life around him. But within a household formed by two women together, there existed, by definition, no equivalent male authority figure at all. Major decisions were made either genuinely collaboratively, or simply by whichever woman happened to feel most strongly about a given particular issue at the time. The entire domestic space was organized, instead, around distinctly female needs, female daily rhythms, female preferences throughout. This created an entirely different kind of domestic atmosphere altogether. There was no ongoing performance of femininity specifically for a husband's benefit, no carefully maintained beauty routine designed primarily to keep a husband's interest engaged, no constant monitoring of tone or behavior specifically to avoid provoking male displeasure. Women could remain genuinely comfortable, could go entire days without particular concern for their own appearance, could speak with real bluntness without any real worry about being judged insufficiently feminine. They could genuinely prioritize intellectual pursuits over purely decorative concerns, could organize their entire daily schedule around meaningful work or serious study rather than around any man's particular schedule or preferences. The genuine absence of men from these households also meant the corresponding absence of certain very real dangers. There was no risk of unwanted pregnancy, which remained, throughout this period, the single leading cause of death for women during their reproductive years. There was no risk of contracting venereal disease from an unfaithful husband. There was no domestic violence to contend with, which remained, throughout the period, both entirely legal and disturbingly common within conventional marriages. There was no ongoing economic dependence on a man who might, at any point, prove cruel, financially irresponsible, or simply coldly indifferent to his wife's genuine well-being. The considerable physical and economic safety that came directly from living entirely without men present was genuinely substantial, even though it was rarely, if ever, discussed openly at the time. There was also something genuinely, quietly liberating about simply not having to think constantly about men at all. Within conventional women's lives of the period, men remained, in a practical sense, perpetually relevant to nearly every decision. A woman was always, at some level, acutely aware of how men might perceive her, what men might specifically want from her, how best to navigate distinctly male spaces and established male expectations throughout her daily life. But within a household shared entirely between two women, one could, in a very real sense, simply set aside thinking about men altogether. They became, in effect, mere background noise, people to be dealt with only when practically necessary, but who otherwise held no meaningful claim whatsoever on one's ongoing emotional or mental energy. This particular arrangement created genuine space for women to discover or actively develop aspects of their own personality that conventional heterosexual relationships very often actively suppressed. A woman who had spent her entire earlier life carefully trying to appear appropriately feminine specifically in order to attract a suitable husband might well discover, within this different kind of household, that she genuinely preferred masculine clothing, or physically demanding outdoor labor, or vigorous intellectual debate, qualities that would have been actively discouraged within any conventional marriage market, but which proved perfectly acceptable within a genuinely female household, where no man's opinion needed to be considered or accommodated. Women could freely explore their full range of authentic interests, personality traits, and desires without constantly filtering every choice through the persistent underlying question of what men might specifically think. Of course, men never entirely disappeared from these women's lives altogether, however carefully constructed their household might be. Brothers might well interfere directly in their sisters' romantic friendships, motivated by genuine concern over family reputation, or by a simple desire to maintain ongoing control over family finances. Male physicians might be formally called in specifically to diagnose and treat women whose particular attachment to one another seemed, to outside observers, unusually intense. Male legal authorities continued throughout to control matters of inheritance, formal property rights, and the basic legal ability to enter into binding contracts, meaning women could genuinely never be entirely free of underlying male authority and control, even within their own carefully constructed all-female households. The broader system, in other words, still fundamentally circumscribed exactly what remained genuinely possible for these women. But within whatever practical boundaries they could reasonably carve out for themselves, women nonetheless created genuine spaces where men, quite simply, didn't meaningfully matter, spaces where male approval, male presence, and male authority became, in practice, entirely optional at best, and largely irrelevant at worst. This was, arguably, the single most genuinely threatening aspect of romantic friendships to the broader established social order. Not the simple fact that women were loving one another, but rather the fact that they were actively demonstrating they could build entirely complete, genuinely satisfying lives without any male involvement whatsoever. It suggested, quite directly, that established male authority and conventional heterosexual marriage weren't necessarily natural, inevitable necessities at all, but were instead simply social constructs that women could, under the right particular circumstances, learn to simply step neatly around. Chapter 25. Spinsterhood's Quiet, Underappreciated Freedom. The particular word spinster carried real social stigma throughout this period, but it also, somewhat surprisingly, carried genuine freedom alongside that stigma. Unmarried women were, without question, generally pitied by broader society, yet they were also, quite conveniently, largely left entirely alone as a direct result. And if a particular spinster happened to maintain a devoted female companion, society at large generally regarded this arrangement as simply charitable in nature. How genuinely kind of Miss Whitfield to keep poor Miss Bellamy proper company in her evident loneliness. No one, generally, thought to ask too many probing further questions. No one particularly pried into the matter further. The spinster in question and her companion could, as a direct result, live together quietly, modestly, and quite genuinely happily, provided, of course, they never made too much visible noise about the true nature of their arrangement. The word spinster itself was, originally, entirely neutral in its established meaning. It simply denoted, quite literally, a woman who spun thread professionally for her living. But by the Regency era proper, the term had acquired considerable layers of both pity and outright contempt in common usage. Spinsters were widely regarded as genuine failures within the established marriage market, women who had somehow been passed over entirely, judged either too plain, too impoverished, or simply too old to successfully attract a suitable husband. They occupied, as a direct result, a genuinely uncomfortable social position, no longer considered proper girls, yet never quite becoming wives either, possessing no clearly defined social role of their own within the broader community. They typically remained financial dependents within their own parents' households, or existed as poor relations living entirely on the ongoing charity of wealthier extended family members. But this particular marginal social status also meant that spinsters remained, in a practical sense, largely invisible to broader society. Society had, in effect, already firmly categorized them as fundamentally unimportant, as women who genuinely didn't matter a great deal, having failed to fulfill what was considered their primary social purpose of marrying and producing legitimate heirs for a husband. This particular invisibility, while undeniably insulting in its underlying implications, also proved genuinely protective in practice. Almost no one paid especially close attention to what spinsters actually did with their considerable free time, where precisely they chose to live, or specifically who they happened to live alongside. They existed, in effect, entirely beneath serious notice, which meant, quite conveniently, they also existed almost entirely beneath meaningful scrutiny. When two spinsters made the deliberate decision to live together, this arrangement was generally interpreted as simply a practical, sensible solution to their shared underlying problem of remaining socially unwanted. They could reasonably pool their genuinely limited financial resources, provide one another with regular company, and thereby avoid becoming complete financial burdens on their respective families going forward. At least they have each other, people would typically remark, with a particular mixture of genuine pity and quiet relief, that these particular unmarriageable women had somehow managed to become reasonably self-sufficient. Almost no one seriously considered the genuine possibility that these particular women might have actively, deliberately chosen spinsterhood for themselves, might have actively rejected conventional marriage specifically in favor of building a shared life together instead. The typical spinster companion household tended to be genuinely modest in scale, reflecting the naturally limited financial means available to women who had no husband providing regular financial support. They might rent a small countryside cottage, take modest lodgings within a local market town, or occasionally live within the dower house situated on a family estate. They typically maintained only minimal domestic staff, perhaps a single maid-of-all work, or else managed the household chores themselves entirely. They lived, on the whole, quite quietly, regularly attending church services, working steadily at needlework, reading extensively, taking regular walks, occasionally visiting local neighbors. It amounted, on the surface, to a genuinely retiring, almost entirely invisible existence. Yet within that particular modest household, the two women involved were genuinely free in ways married women of the period simply could never hope to be. They answered to literally no one else. They organized their own daily schedule entirely as they personally pleased. They could remain awake reading all through the night if they genuinely wished to, or spend an entire day comfortably in bed if the mood happened to strike them. They could freely prioritize their own particular interests and personal projects without ever needing to defer to established male authority or accommodate any man's specific needs or preferences. Their own time, their own private space, their entire shared life belonged, quite genuinely, entirely to themselves. The broader spinster identity also provided real, meaningful protection from any lingering sexual suspicion. Spinsters were widely presumed, by contemporary social convention, to be not merely unmarried, but effectively asexual altogether. Women whose particular sexual possibilities had, in society's own estimation, permanently closed the moment they failed to secure a husband. This particular assumption meant that when two spinsters chose to live together, shared a single bed regularly, and openly expressed devoted affection toward one another, this was widely interpreted as genuinely poignant rather than remotely suspicious. They were understood to be simply making the best of what society considered their lonely, entirely sexless remaining lives, by keeping each other reasonably good company. Almost no one seriously imagined these particular dried-up old maids, as the unkind phrase of the era sometimes had it, might actually be conducting genuinely passionate romantic relationships with one another, which meant, quite conveniently, they could often do precisely that without anyone giving the matter a second serious thought. Some women actively, deliberately cultivated this particular spinster identity specifically as effective camouflage. They dressed noticeably conservatively, carefully avoided anything that might suggest youthful beauty or lingering sexuality, and consistently emphasized their own advancing age and firmly unmarried status. They deliberately presented themselves publicly as somewhat eccentric, rather cold ladies genuinely content with their own quiet, unremarkable lives, perhaps slightly ridiculous in the eyes of others, but essentially harmless. This particular careful performance of harmless spinsterhood allowed them to live together with real openness alongside their genuine companions, while effectively deflecting any serious scrutiny of the true underlying nature of their relationship. The genuine financial precarity inherent in spinsterhood remained, throughout, its single greatest practical challenge. Without husbands or reliable family financial support, spinster companions were, in a great many documented cases, genuinely poor, dependent instead on small personal annuities, modest inheritances, or the ongoing charity of more distant relatives. They were forced, as a result, to remain extremely careful with their limited money, making every single penny available to them stretch as far as it possibly could. This particular ongoing poverty could prove genuinely stressful and considerably limiting in practice, but it also meant, quite significantly, that these women had genuinely nothing further left to lose in terms of established social status. They were already, by conventional standards, positioned near the very bottom of the broader social hierarchy, which, quite paradoxically, gave them real freedom to live precisely as they genuinely chose, with relatively little additional social cost to worry about. Local communities very often contained several distinct spinster households, made up of women living either alone or together in pairs, effectively forming a kind of genuine informal network of unmarried women who deeply understood one another's shared circumstances. They visited each other regularly, shared limited resources when needed, and provided one another with genuine mutual support throughout. Within these particular established local networks, romantic friendships were both entirely common and quietly accepted without much further comment. Everyone locally understood, without ever quite saying so directly, that Miss Ashworth and Miss Reeve were particularly devoted to one another, just as Miss Cartwright and Miss Denby were, in their own way, genuinely inseparable. No one within these local communities ever named the underlying relationship explicitly, but everyone nonetheless clearly understood that certain spinster households amounted, in practice, to considerably more than merely practical shared living arrangements. The spinster companion model proved, over time, so genuinely common and so broadly socially acceptable that it became, in a meaningful sense, almost fully institutionalized within Regency society. Young women growing up could readily look around their own local communities and observe several genuinely respectable examples of established spinster households firsthand, real, visible proof that it was entirely possible to live a full life without ever marrying, that a woman could build a genuinely complete and fulfilling life alongside a devoted female companion instead. This particular visibility of an alternative life path, however modest and socially marginalized it may have remained overall, gave a great many women genuine options and genuine hope that they might not otherwise have ever seriously considered possible for themselves. Chapter 26: Poetry, the Safest Available Form of Confession. Regency women wrote poetry constantly and consistently throughout their lives, some of it formally published, though the considerable majority remained genuinely private, shared only between the two women directly involved. And the particular poems women composed specifically for one another were, by any honest reading, genuinely intense in their expressed content. Your eyes shine brighter than any distant star. Your voice carries more beauty than the finest music I have ever heard. I would willingly cross entire oceans simply to stand near you again. This was never, by any reasonable interpretation, merely casual poetic exercise. This constituted raw, genuine emotion carefully distilled into formal rhyme and meter. Some of this particular poetry was shared relatively openly, disguised carefully as generalized poetic sentiment suitable for wider circulation. Some was kept entirely secret, tucked carefully within personal letters or hidden away within private journals. But all of it, without meaningful exception, stood as genuine evidence of feelings simply too large to remain fully contained within the heart alone. Poetry represented, throughout this period, the single most socially acceptable form of emotional expression available to Regency women more broadly, while writing novels remained, at the time, still somewhat socially suspect, implying, to many contemporary observers, an unbecoming degree of worldly ambition on the part of the female author. Poetry, by contrast, was widely considered entirely appropriately feminine in nature. It was regarded as a genuinely harmless outlet for authentic sensibility and refined emotional feeling. Women were actively encouraged throughout their education to compose verse regularly, to carefully capture their own genuine emotions and observations within elegant, carefully controlled poetic stanzas. This particular cultural permission meant women could, in practice, write extremely passionate, deeply personal poetry without immediately arousing any real suspicion of genuine impropriety. The particular poems women composed to and about one another ranged considerably in tone, from conventionally friendly in nature, all the way through to entirely unmistakably romantic in their true underlying content. Some were carefully structured as formal tributes to friendship, employing appropriately classical references and entirely conventional sentiment throughout. These particular poems could reasonably be shared quite openly, read aloud at social gatherings, or even occasionally published within contemporary women's periodicals of the period. But the considerably more personal poems, the ones composed during genuinely private moments of longing, or occasionally of pure joy, very often drop this particular careful pretense entirely. Your absence has left a genuine wound within me that simply refuses to properly heal. One such poem read. I dream constantly of your touch, and wake each morning aching for what my dreams alone can never fully provide. A great many women developed entire extended cycles of love poetry, addressed specifically to their devoted companions, sometimes composed under carefully adopted pseudonyms, or with the beloved's actual gender deliberately left entirely ambiguous throughout the text itself. A woman might compose an entire extended series of formal sonnets addressed to her particular beloved without ever explicitly specifying the beloved's gender anywhere within the poems themselves, allowing the completed work to be reasonably read by outsiders as conventional heterosexual love poetry, should anyone unfamiliar with the true underlying context happen to encounter it. But the particular woman actually receiving these poems knew, with complete certainty, precisely who her beloved genuinely was, and understood fully every single private reference, every shared inside joke, every carefully encoded declaration deliberately hidden within seemingly innocent verse. The formal technical requirements inherent in poetry itself, established rhyme schemes, careful metrical structure, recognized poetic forms, provided a kind of protective structure that made genuinely intense emotion considerably more socially palatable overall. A woman could write quite directly, "My very soul burns with genuine desire for your embrace," and because the sentiment was expressed within formal poetic structure, it registered to contemporary readers as elevated art and was therefore broadly acceptable. The identical underlying sentiment expressed instead in ordinary prose might well have seemed considerably too direct, too overtly physical, too unmistakably sexual in its plain meaning. But carefully wrapped within accepted poetic form, it became, in the eyes of contemporary society, genuine art rather than direct confession, even though, in truth, it remained very much both simultaneously. Some poetry of the period drew deliberately on classical or mythological references, specifically to express same-sex love more safely. Poems referencing Sappho and her celebrated island community of women poets proved particularly popular among women writing to other women, offering a readily available classical precedent for authentic female same-sex desire. A woman could write openly about sapphic devotion, or the love of Lesbos specifically, and technically be understood as simply referencing established ancient Greek poetry, while, in genuine practice, actually describing her own contemporary feelings and lived relationships in considerable detail. This particular classical framework provided both a degree of genuine intellectual legitimacy and, simultaneously, real plausible deniability should the poem ever fall into the wrong hands. Natural imagery dominated a great deal of this particular poetry, with women consistently describing their beloved companions in terms of flowers, distant stars, moonlight, the break of dawn. "You are the very rose that blooms eternally within my heart's own private garden. You are the moon that quietly lights my very darkest nights. You are the welcome spring that follows an endless, weary winter." These particular phrases were not yet, at the time, the tired clichés they might read as today. Or rather, they became clichés specifically because so many countless women had already used remarkably similar language to describe the women they genuinely loved, gradually creating an entire shared coded vocabulary of natural imagery that other women could readily recognize and correctly interpret when they encountered it. Religious imagery also appeared with real frequency throughout this poetry, with women regularly describing their love for one another in terms of worship, spiritual devotion, and genuine transcendent union. "You are my own private temple, my constant prayer, my very salvation," read one surviving poem. This particular deliberate blending of romantic and religious language allowed women to express the genuinely transcendent, overwhelming quality of their authentic feelings, while simultaneously maintaining a comfortable veneer of established respectability throughout. After all, intense religious feeling of any kind remained, throughout this period, not merely acceptable, but actively celebrated within broader contemporary culture. Some of the genuinely most powerful surviving poetry emerged directly from moments of painful separation or profound loss. Women composed genuinely desperate verses whenever their beloved companions were away traveling, whenever they feared losing one another permanently, or in the direct aftermath of a relationship's painful conclusion. The entire world appears gray and colorless without your particular light. I feel myself but half a person whenever we remain apart. Every single breath brings genuine pain while you remain away from me. These particular poems captured, with real authenticity, the genuine anguish of forced separation or profound heartbreak, giving authentic voice to a grief that simply couldn't be expressed openly through any other available medium of the period. Private poetry collections exchanged between women became, in a considerable number of documented cases, genuinely treasured personal possessions. A woman might carefully compile her own accumulated poems into a handmade personal book, presenting it formally to her beloved companion as a meaningful gift, creating, in effect, a genuine physical object that embodied their entire relationship in tangible form. These particular poetry books were typically kept carefully hidden away, read and reread repeatedly during private moments alone, treasured as lasting evidence of a love that couldn't be proclaimed publicly, yet remained permanently preserved in verse regardless. The poetry women wrote specifically for one another reveals something that formal letters and private diaries occasionally, by their own nature, tend to obscure somewhat. These weren't merely intense emotional attachments, or simply unusually close friendships taken to an unusual extreme. They were, quite genuinely, authentic experiences of romantic love, complete with every single traditional marker found consistently in love poetry composed by lovers across countless centuries and cultures. The genuine longing, the sustained devotion, the real sexual tension only barely contained within careful metaphor, the authentic joy of reciprocated feeling, the profound despair that inevitably accompanies genuine separation. All of it appears throughout these particular poems, expressed in precisely the same register found consistently within conventional heterosexual love poetry of the period, because the underlying emotion itself remained, in every meaningful sense, entirely identical regardless of which particular genders happen to be genuinely involved. What we owe them. So tonight, as you finally drift off to sleep in your own modern bed, with your legally recognized marriage rights, with your genuine freedom to hold hands publicly with whomever you choose, entirely without fear of being formally institutionalized for hysteria, perhaps spare a genuine thought for the Regency women who came so long before you. The women who loved one another desperately and completely, yet were permitted at best to call it merely friendship. The women who built entire shared lives together and were required throughout to insist it was purely practical. The women who shared a single bed together for 50 full years and told absolutely everyone it was simply about saving on household heating costs. The women who wrote passionately intense letters and carefully signed them, your devoted companion, because signing them, your lover, would very likely have gotten them formally institutionalized instead. These particular women were, by any fair assessment, remarkably careful, genuinely strategic, endlessly creative in finding whatever ways they possibly could to remain together despite everything working against them. They made use of every available loophole, every established social convention, every genuine blind spot within their culture's limited understanding of relationships between women. They hid, quite deliberately, in perfectly plain sight, calling their genuine marriages friendships, their authentic desire sensibility, their carefully shared households merely economical arrangements. They learned, out of hard necessity, to speak fluently in code, in carefully chosen flowers, in layered poetry, in meaningful glances exchanged quietly across crowded drawing rooms. They became genuine experts in the considerable art of plausible deniability, in maintaining precisely enough protective fiction to remain reasonably safe. And some of them, despite everything, were still eventually caught. Some were forcibly separated by families who finally saw entirely through the careful performance. Some died genuinely alone, having been forcibly torn away from the women they had truly loved. Some spent their entire remaining lives quietly performing a fiction they could never fully set aside, even in complete privacy, never quite able to name, even to themselves in the end, exactly what they had genuinely been to one another. But so many others, genuinely so many others, succeeded regardless. They found one another across crowded ballrooms and shared boarding school dormitories. They fell in love slowly over shared books and long, unhurried walks through quiet gardens. They made solemn promises to one another in whispered private conversations, and then kept those particular promises faithfully for decades afterward. They built genuine homes together, grew old together side by side, and were eventually buried together, their matching headstones reading "devoted companions." Because that particular phrase was, in the end, the closest their era would ever permit them to come to writing "beloved wives." They proved, through the simple accumulated fact of their own lived lives, that genuine love never actually requires formal recognition in order to be entirely real. That authentic desire never requires official permission in order to genuinely exist. That two women can, in fact, build an entirely complete and deeply satisfying life together, even when the whole surrounding world insists, at every turn, that such a thing remains fundamentally impossible. They were genuinely brave, without ever quite being permitted to call it bravery. They were, in every meaningful sense, queer long before that particular word existed as any kind of recognized identity. They were married, in absolutely every respect except the formal legal name for it, and sometimes, given the considerable constraints of their era, that simply had to be enough. History tried in countless quiet ways to erase them entirely, dismissing them consistently as merely friends, as close companions, as women possessing an unusually intense degree of sensibility. But their letters survived regardless. Their private diaries survived. Their carefully composed poetry survived. Their shared graves, resting quietly side by side, survived as well. And now, at this considerable historical distance, we can finally look back and see them with real clarity, for precisely what they genuinely were. Women who loved other women, who found real ways to remain together against genuinely impossible odds, who consistently refused to let society's rigid limitations fully contain their authentic capacity for love. So yes, they shared a single bed because their houses genuinely were cold. They traveled together because unmarried women were expected to maintain a companion. They wrote passionately intense letters because that was simply how genuinely sensible ladies of the period were expected to write. And they loved one another desperately, completely, across entire lifetimes, calling it friendship throughout, because that particular word was, quite simply, the only one their era would ever permit them to use openly. Tonight, as you finally drift off to sleep, remember them. Remember the women who loved in careful code, who married in genuine secret, who built entire meaningful lives together within society's own narrow margins. Remember that love between women is not, in any real sense, some recent modern invention. That women have always, throughout every recorded era of human history, loved other women. That authentic romance between women has existed for exactly as long as there have ever been women alive to feel it. The particular language available changes considerably across time. The available freedoms expand and occasionally contract again. But the underlying love itself has been quietly present throughout, all along, hiding in perfectly plain sight, written carefully into the coded language of flowers and into countless romantic friendships, patiently waiting for someone, eventually, to finally look closely enough to truly see it. Sleep well tonight. And if you happen to wake tomorrow feeling genuinely grateful that you can love exactly whomever you choose, without ever needing to pretend it's merely about saving on household rent, well, you certainly should feel that gratitude. Because these particular women paid, quite genuinely, for that hard-won freedom, in silence, in forced separation, in entire lives lived carefully and deliberately between the lines society allowed them. They loved regardless of the considerable cost. They always have,